From 13 scattered colonies clinging to the Atlantic coast to the most powerful nation the world has ever known, the story of America's rise is as turbulent as it is extraordinary. This series invites you to drift through history, not in a rush, but in thoughtful, immersive steps. We explore the wars, ideas, inventions, migrations, and cultural shifts that shaped the United States, not just as a nation, but as a global force. Through 40 slow-burning chapters, we'll uncover how ambition, violence, resilience, and vision converged to forge the American century, and ask whether it will endure. Part 1: The New World, Colonial Seeds of Empire. Before there was an America, there were whispers, distant voices carried on salty winds across a restless Atlantic. In the early years of the 17th century, wooden ships creaked under the weight of men, women, and children leaving behind all they had known, chasing rumors of land, freedom, and the promise of a second chance. They didn't call it America yet. It was the New World, a place shaped more by myth than by map, more by longing than by logic. And what they found upon arrival was not an empty canvas, but a living, breathing land inhabited by ancient peoples, governed by sacred traditions, and watched over by spirits far older than European memory. Jamestown rose slowly in the swampy heat of Virginia, not with triumph but with hunger. The colonists faced disease, distrust, and death. Half of them would not survive the first winter. Still, they stayed. Not because they were strong, but because they were desperate. And desperation has always played a quiet role in the making of empires. To the north, in Plymouth, another group, Pilgrims, landed with scriptures in hand, looking not for wealth, but for refuge. Their struggle was no less brutal. The earth was unfamiliar. The winters were cruel. But with time, something began to take root, not just crops, but customs, confidence, and the slow spread of English law across native soil. The land, of course, was not theirs. It had belonged to the Powhatan, the Wampanoag, and dozens of other nations long before the first English prayer was whispered under American sky. Treaties were made and broken. Friendships were forged, then betrayed. What began as cautious coexistence soon gave way to conflict, disease, and displacement. It was a painful beginning, an origin story etched in contradiction, liberty and conquest, faith and greed, survival and subjugation. Yet from these ragged settlements came the seedlings of a new identity. 13 colonies, scattered along the coast, each with its own flavor, its own rhythm. Virginia's tobacco fields filled ships bound for London. New England's timber-built fleets. In Pennsylvania, Quakers preached tolerance. In Georgia, debtors sought redemption. The colonies were children of Europe, but already they were growing restless. The forests seemed endless. The rivers ran untamed. The distance from king and crown stretched wider with every passing season. Trade flourished. Towns grew. Slavery took hold, imported not just as labor, but as an institution, one that would define, divide, and haunt the nation yet to come. Wealth accumulated in ports like Charleston and Boston. Ideas traveled with it. Enlightenment thinkers began to speak of natural rights, of liberty and reason. And though few would yet call themselves Americans, a sense of separateness had begun to form, subtle, like fog lifting over early morning fields. Still, these were fragile beginnings. The colonies were not yet united. Their loyalties were divided, their economies uneven, their futures uncertain. But something lived in the soil, in the tension between ambition and survival, in the clash between cultures, in the uneasy peace between wilderness and town. That something would grow, slowly and relentlessly, over generations. The land was vast, the people young, the dreams unshaped. But already, history had laid its first foundation stones. The future empire was still a whisper. Yet in the quiet crackle of colonial fires, in the ink of merchant ledgers, in the solemn tolling of church bells, the first heartbeat of what would become the United States could be heard. Soft. Unsteady. But undeniably there. Part 2, Revolutionary Fire, the War for Independence. Long before the first musket fired, revolution had already begun, quietly, in taverns and town squares, in pamphlets and whispered grievances passed between neighbors. The colonies, once grateful outposts of a distant crown, had begun to strain under the invisible weight of empire. Britain, victorious after its wars with France, sought to tighten its grip on the colonies it had long allowed to grow wild. Taxes came first, small at first, but symbolic: sugar, stamps, tea. And with each new act, came protest, boycotts, and a growing sense that this land, this life, could no longer be ruled from across the sea. The language of resistance sharpened. The names of men like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Thomas Paine moved from the mouths of rebels to the pages of history. They spoke of rights not granted by kings but born into every man, radical, dangerous ideas in an age of monarchs. In Boston, tea floated like protest on the harbor's surface. In Philadelphia, delegates gathered not to raise arms, but to raise questions, though they would not remain rhetorical for long. The clash was inevitable. In April of 1775, the sleepy towns of Lexington and Concord were shattered by gunfire, and in those short, violent moments, the divide became a war. Farmers dropped plows for rifles. Blacksmiths became soldiers. Fathers kissed children goodbye, not knowing if they'd return. George Washington, a tall Virginian with a calm resolve, took command, not of an army, but of an idea that had yet to be truly formed. The war itself was long, uneven, and brutal. The Continental Army, ragtag and underfed, faced the greatest military power on earth. British troops marched in formation. American militias scattered and struck from trees. Winters froze bones and blunted hope, Valley Forge a frozen testament to endurance. But something held. Not just tactics or terrain, but belief. A belief that liberty, however undefined, was worth more than comfort or safety. Across the Atlantic, Britain waged war not just on the battlefield but in diplomacy, strategy, and supply. But the longer the war dragged on, the more it cost in gold and morale. And slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. With France entering the conflict, the colonial cause gained ships, men, and legitimacy. In 1781, at a quiet Virginia town called Yorktown, the end began. British General Cornwallis, trapped and outmaneuvered, surrendered. The war was not won in a single battle, but that surrender echoed like a bell tolling across 2 continents. Still, the birth of the United States was no clean break. It was a bleeding, uncertain thing. 13 colonies became 13 states, suspicious of one another, bound by common cause but divided by ambition, geography, and fear. The Articles of Confederation, their first attempt at unity, proved fragile. The peace was as tenuous as the war had been bold. Yet something irreversible had occurred. A monarchy had been defied and defeated. A new kind of nation was taking shape, not forged by bloodline or crown, but by ink, debate, and the exhausted hope of ordinary people. The Declaration of Independence, with its bold claim that all men are created equal, had not only justified the revolution, it had seeded a dream that would outlive its authors. But liberty was unevenly distributed. For the enslaved, the war offered little more than a change of masters. For native nations, it brought betrayal and broken promises. For women, it brought labor and loss, but not recognition. And still, amid all the contradiction, the foundation of a republic had been laid, imperfect, flawed, but undeniably real. The war was over. The world watched, uncertain if the experiment would last. But the fire had been lit, not only in America but in the imagination of peoples everywhere. Freedom, once the prize of kings and conquerors, was now an idea that could belong to the governed. And in that radical spark, a superpower began, not in strength, but in the belief that power itself could be drawn from the people. Part 3, The Constitution, Forging a Fragile Unity. The war had ended, but the battle for America's soul had only just begun. With muskets silenced and redcoats gone, the question that loomed largest was not how to win independence, but how to survive it. 13 colonies, now states, stood uneasily beside one another, bound by victory, but divided by need, ambition, and mistrust. The Articles of Confederation, drafted during the war as a loose agreement, proved too weak for the weight of peace. There was no power to tax, no strong executive, no authority to settle disputes between states. Commerce floundered, debts mounted, and rebellion simmered. In Massachusetts, farmers rose in fury, Shays' Rebellion, a symptom of a nation teetering on the edge of collapse. Into this chaos came a call, a meeting, a convention, not to abandon the Republic but to save it. In the sweltering heat of the Philadelphia summer in 1787, delegates arrived from across the new nation. Some came reluctantly, others with grand designs. Among them were men whose names would become synonymous with the very idea of America: Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, and Washington. They were not always of one mind, but they were of one urgency: to forge something durable, something that might hold this fragile union together. The Constitutional Convention was not a peaceful gathering, it was a crucible. Ideas clashed, tempers flared. Should representation be equal for all states or based on population? Should the federal government be strong or deferential to the states? Should the presidency be a singular executive, or a council of equals? Behind closed doors, compromises were struck, not because they satisfied all, but because they satisfied enough. The result was the Constitution, a document brief in length, but vast in meaning. It was not perfect, and the men who signed it knew as much. It allowed for slavery to persist, counted the enslaved as 3/5 of a person, and made no mention of women or native peoples. But it also created a government with checks and balances, a bicameral legislature, a powerful yet limited executive, and a judiciary meant to endure. Most critically, it included a mechanism to grow, to amend, to correct, to evolve. It was not a blueprint set in stone, but a framework upon which future generations could build. Ratification was no guarantee. Fierce debate raged between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The former praised the new Constitution's strength, the latter feared the specter of another tyranny. Out of this clash came promises, chief among them, the Bill of Rights. 10 amendments, enshrining freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and the right to a fair trial, protections against the very abuses the Revolution had resisted. In 1789, the new government was born. George Washington, the reluctant leader, became the first president, setting precedent with every step. The capital shifted from New York to Philadelphia, and eventually to a muddy patch of land that would become Washington, D.C. The first Congress assembled, uncertain yet determined. The first laws were passed. The first crises tested the new order. But even then, unity was more an aspiration than a reality. Regional divides remained. Economic interests clashed. Political factions formed, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, foreshadowing the partisanship to come. Still, beneath all the argument and anxiety, a quiet miracle took root: the peaceful transfer of power, the functioning of a democratic republic in a world of kings. The Constitution did not solve all of America's problems. It did not bind its people in perfect harmony. But it offered a vessel, a living document, that could endure storms, carry ideals, and stretch with the times. Its preamble began with a promise not of perfection, but of pursuit, to form a more perfect union. Not perfect, more perfect. It was an acknowledgement of flaw, and a commitment to strive. This was the real birth of America, not in the gunfire of revolution, but in the ink of compromise. Not in declarations of war, but in declarations of intention. In Philadelphia, a nation was not just freed. It was framed. And though the foundation was imperfect, it was strong enough to stand, to bend, and, crucially, to be rebuilt again and again by those who would inherit it. Part 4, Manifest Destiny, The Long March Westward. The Atlantic had once been the edge of the known world. For generations, Americans had gazed eastward, toward Europe, toward war, toward their colonial past. But now, with independence secured and a fragile union underway, the eyes of a young nation began to shift. Westward, the land stretched unbroken, vast and unclaimed, at least by the logic of empires. Rolling hills gave way to great rivers, forests bowed to prairies, and mountains loomed like ancient sentinels, hiding worlds beyond them. It was not just space, it was possibility. And in the hearts of many Americans, a new idea began to take root, that this land, all of it, was theirs to inherit. Manifest destiny was not coined with a trumpet blast or a presidential decree. It rose quietly, like the tide, a fusion of ambition, faith, and self-righteous certainty. The phrase itself, first used in 1845, would come later, but the belief preceded the words. It was a story Americans told themselves, that expansion was not only inevitable, but divinely ordained. That from sea to shining sea, a continent was meant to be one unified republic, a beacon of liberty and civilization. But beneath the poetry of destiny was the grit of politics and conquest. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had nearly doubled the nation's territory overnight, secured with little more than a signature and a staggering sum. President Jefferson, the architect of Republican simplicity, suddenly became the architect of empire. Yet the land bought from France was barely known. It took explorers, Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, and others, to map it, to name it, and to make it real in the minds of Eastern citizens. And then came the settlers. They came in wagons and on foot, families packed into rickety wooden boxes, chasing dreams and dodging despair. The trails westward became arteries of hope, and sometimes graves. The Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and the Mormon Trail carved across the wilderness, each step forward bringing hardship and heartbreak. There were rivers to ford, mountains to cross, diseases to survive, and storms to endure. Yet the movement never ceased. Land was cheap. Opportunities were many. And the hunger for space, for self-reliance, for something more, it burned in the bones of a restless people. But this march was not bloodless. Native nations, who had lived on these lands for centuries, stood in the path of this destiny. Treaties were signed, and broken. Promises were made, and ignored. Entire cultures were uprooted, displaced, and destroyed. The Trail of Tears was not destiny, it was death. And for every line redrawn on a map, there were lives scattered in its wake. Texas declared its independence, then sought annexation. War followed, first with Mexico, then the absorption of California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more. The Mexican-American War, often brushed aside in popular memory, was pivotal in shaping the continental United States. It expanded the borders, yes, but it also expanded the contradictions. For with every new state or territory, the question of slavery reared its head. Would these lands be free or slaveholding? Could a country so divided on the issue grow without splintering? Even as the West glittered with promise, gold in California, farmland in the Midwest, timber in Oregon, the tension grew. Railroads stitched the continent together, steel rails laid like veins, pulsing with progress and peril. Towns sprung up overnight. Fortunes were made and lost. But so too were the voices of those displaced, the native, the enslaved, the poor. Manifest destiny did not always make room for everyone in its promise. Still, the idea endured. The United States had reached the Pacific, had swallowed the land between two oceans. It had grown in size and stature. It had fulfilled its myth, if not its morality. And with every step west, it had grown stronger, militarily, economically, strategically. But it had also inherited the seeds of internal conflict. Expansion came with a price. The more land it acquired, the harder it became to reconcile the contradictions at its core. What kind of freedom allowed slavery? What kind of equality erased entire peoples? What kind of democracy silenced the voices of half its population? The answers would not come quickly. They would fester, boil, and finally explode. But in the age of manifest destiny, the United States was still a land in motion, rushing forward, building towards something vast, unsure whether it was creating a dream, or running headlong into a reckoning. Part 5, Slavery and the Seeds of Division. Even as the stars on the flag multiplied and the frontiers widened with each passing year, a dark undercurrent ran beneath the foundations of the young republic. It had been there from the beginning, embedded in the very architecture of the Constitution, whispered behind the debates of liberty and equality. Slavery. A contradiction so vast, so morally corrosive, that it threatened to unravel the nation long before it ever reached maturity. In the southern states, slavery was not merely tolerated, it was essential. Cotton was king, and enslaved labor was the machinery behind its rule. The vast plantations that stretched across the Carolinas, Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama thrived not because of climate or soil alone, but because millions of human beings were treated as property, bought, sold, beaten, and broken to serve an economy rooted in exploitation. Men, women, and children, stripped of identity and freedom, lived under the constant threat of the lash, their lives reduced to numbers on a planter's ledger. But the North was not innocent. Though slavery was gradually abolished in most northern states, the textile mills of Massachusetts and New York depended heavily on southern cotton. Financial institutions insured slave ships and profited from human cargo. Even abolitionist voices, however loud, were often met with resistance, not just from those invested in slavery's profits, but from those afraid of what a truly equal society might mean. Fear of competition, of miscegenation, of cultural upheaval, it all fed the quiet complicity that let slavery endure. And yet, voices rose. Frederick Douglass, once enslaved, now eloquent and fierce, wrote and spoke with a clarity that cut through apathy. Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people, risked her life time and again to bring others to freedom through the Underground Railroad. William Lloyd Garrison thundered through the pages of The Liberator, demanding not compromise, but immediate emancipation. And still, others plotted rebellion, like Nat Turner, whose uprising left the South trembling and more brutal than ever in response. The nation was growing, but with each mile west, the question returned, would these new lands allow slavery? The Missouri Compromise had temporarily calmed the waters in 1820, drawing a line across the map and declaring certain territories free, others slaveholding. But lines on a map did not erase the deeper divide. They merely postponed the inevitable. With the annexation of Texas, the war with Mexico, and the addition of California, the pressure built again. The Compromise of 1850 tried once more to hold the center. It failed. The Fugitive Slave Act inflamed the North. Uncle Tom's Cabin stirred hearts and provoked backlash. Kansas bled. The center did not hold. Political parties fractured. The Whigs dissolved. The Democrats splintered. A new party rose, the Republicans, founded not just on opposition to slavery, but on a vision of free labor, free land, and free men. Abraham Lincoln, tall and quiet, with a sorrowful face and a mind sharpened by self-education, began to speak not just of economics, but of a moral reckoning. A house divided, he warned, cannot stand. And the South listened. Not to Lincoln's warning, but to his threat, as they saw it. The election of 1860 was no mere transfer of power. It was the cracking of an illusion. For the South, the Union no longer protected their way of life. For the North, the cost of compromise had become too great. But beneath the rhetoric and politics, it was still about people. About families torn apart on auction blocks. About children born into chains. About men who worked the fields with no hope of rest, women who nursed the children of their oppressors, and generations raised under the boot of brutality. It was about the soul of a country that dared to call itself free while shackling millions in silence. Slavery was not just a Southern sin. It was an American wound. And like all deep wounds, it would bleed before it could heal. The seeds had been planted. The storm was coming. And soon, the fragile dream of unity would be torn by fire and iron. Part 6, A Nation Torn, The American Civil War. The air felt different in April of 1861. Across the rolling hills of Virginia, through the cobbled streets of Charleston, in the echoing halls of Washington, something ancient and terrible stirred. It wasn't just the beginning of a war, it was the rupture of an idea, the sundering of a national myth that had barely held together. What began with a cannon shot at Fort Sumter would become 4 years of fire, grief, and reckoning. The United States had always been a patchwork. Different economies, cultures, and values bound by the thinnest cords of shared history and aspiration. But when the South seceded, forming the Confederate States of America, It made clear that the old compromises had failed. Now, there were two flags, two presidents, two visions of freedom. And neither side would back down. The early months brought with them a haze of romanticism. Young men in both North and South rushed to enlist, uniforms still clean, drums still beating proud. But that illusion didn't last. The fields of Antietam, Shiloh, and Gettysburg turned red with a level of blood the nation had never imagined. Thousands fell in a single day. Bullets tore through flesh. Artillery shattered bone. And with each battle, the war became less about glory and more about endurance, less about strategy and more about survival. Lincoln, weary-eyed and burdened, bore the weight of a divided people. His speeches, calm but resolute, sought to hold the Union together not just by force, but by meaning. In 1863, he stood on the muddy ground of Gettysburg and spoke of a new birth of freedom. Short in length, vast in purpose, the address reframed the war not just as a fight to preserve a Union, but as a struggle to redefine its soul. And at the heart of that struggle was slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation was not just policy, it was transformation. Though limited in immediate effect, it changed the war's moral terrain. It welcomed formerly enslaved men into the Union Army. It declared to the world that the United States would not only fight for territory, but for principle. And it ensured that the Confederacy would never receive recognition from European powers. Yet the war ground on. General Grant pressed forward with grim determination in the East. Sherman marched to the sea, cutting a swath through Georgia and breaking the Confederate will from within. The South, once rich with resources, now starved and bled. Cities burned. Plantations fell silent. And still, the fighting continued. Families were torn apart, not just across battle lines, but within them. Brothers fought brothers. Fathers buried sons. Entire towns became graveyards. And amid it all, enslaved people seized moments of liberation, fleeing to Union lines, resisting from within, daring to dream of something they had never known. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. At Appomattox Courthouse, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant, not in humiliation, but in silence, with dignity stripped by years of loss. Lincoln, meanwhile, dared to look toward healing. His second inaugural was not a victory speech, it was a prayer. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he pleaded. But just days after victory, a bullet silenced him in Ford's Theater. The war had ended. Over 600,000 were dead. Slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. But the wounds, physical, emotional, moral, remained open. Reconstruction would follow, full of promise and betrayal, but that was still to come. For now, the land was quiet. The guns fell silent. The smoke cleared. And in that silence, America stood at a crossroads, not the triumphant beacon it had once imagined itself to be, but something scarred and sobered. It had survived its own breaking. But in doing so, it was forever changed. The question now was not just whether the Union could be rebuilt. It was whether the promise of America could finally be made real. Part 7, Rebuilding the Union, the Turbulence of Reconstruction. When the cannons stopped firing and the flags of surrender were lowered, the United States emerged from the Civil War not whole, but wounded. The fields were quiet now, the smoke had cleared, and yet the echoes of battle lingered in every courthouse, every broken home, every freed soul trying to find their footing in a country that had never truly seen them as free. The war had ended, but the struggle for the soul of America was far from over. What followed was reconstruction, not just of buildings or railroads, but of identity, governance, and justice itself. The South lay in ruins. Cities like Atlanta and Richmond bore the scars of fire and siege. Plantations stood empty or smoldering, their labor force emancipated, their wealth gone. For white Southerners, there was humiliation and confusion. For the newly freed black population, there was a trembling hope and uncertainty. For a million men, women, and children who had lived their lives in bondage now stood, legally free, at the threshold of a nation that had not prepared to embrace them. President Andrew Johnson, who inherited the office after Lincoln's assassination, took a lenient approach toward the defeated South. He prioritized swift restoration of the Union over justice or transformation, issuing pardons to former Confederates and allowing the old Southern elite to return to power. Under his watch, Southern legislatures enacted black codes, laws that attempted to trap freedmen in systems of quasi-slavery, denying them basic rights and keeping them economically shackled. But Congress, led by the radical Republicans, pushed back. Determined to reshape the South and safeguard the rights of freedmen, they passed a series of Reconstruction acts that divided the former Confederacy into military districts and demanded new state constitutions guaranteeing black suffrage. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, while the 15th sought to protect voting rights regardless of race. These were monumental steps, idealistic and bold. And for a moment, the impossible seemed possible. African Americans organized. They voted in droves, held political office, established schools, built churches, and founded mutual aid societies. Formerly enslaved men took seats in state legislatures and even in Congress. For the first time in American history, black citizens exercised power in a meaningful way. There were towns where the future shimmered with promise, halls where justice was spoken in new voices, fields where labor was paid and dignity earned. But the backlash came swift and cruel. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups rose from the ashes of Confederate defeat, wielding terror like a weapon. Lynchings, night raids, arson, these became the dark tools of resistance against change. In Washington, Northern will to continue Reconstruction waned. Fatigue set in. Economic depression shifted focus. And slowly, federal troops withdrew, leaving the South to home rule once more. By 1877, with the compromise that settled the disputed presidential election, Reconstruction officially ended. Federal forces departed. The fragile progress made by black Americans was rolled back under a new system of segregation and disenfranchisement, Jim Crow. The dream of a multiracial democracy, briefly visible, was buried beneath decades of institutional racism and neglect. Still, the legacy of Reconstruction was not entirely lost. The constitutional amendments, though often unenforced, remained as beacons for future generations. The churches, schools, and communities founded by freedmen endured. And the memory of what could have been, what briefly was, stayed alive in stories, songs, and quiet defiance. Reconstruction was not a failure of vision. It was a failure of resolve. America had been given a second chance to define itself, to reckon with its contradictions and build something more just. Instead, it chose comfort over courage, reunion over righteousness. But in that brief window, the groundwork for future justice had been laid. The war had ended slavery. But Reconstruction revealed the deeper battle, whether a nation built on freedom could truly extend that promise to all. Part 8, The Gilded Cage, Industry, Wealth, and the Forgotten Masses. The years that followed Reconstruction bore witness to one of the most dramatic transformations in American history. The United States, barely healed from civil war, surged forward into a new age, not of cotton and cannon, but of steel, smoke, and ambition. The air in cities like Pittsburgh and Chicago grew thick with soot, while skylines were pierced by factories and chimneys rather than church steeples or Capitol domes. This was the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain, who saw behind the glittering surface a rot of inequality and corruption. At the heart of it all was industry. Railroads stitched the vast American landscape together, connecting coast to coast, and bringing with them opportunity and exploitation in equal measure. With every spike driven into the soil, new towns sprang to life, and new fortunes were made. Steel barons like Andrew Carnegie rose from humble beginnings to unimaginable wealth, while oil magnates like John D. Rockefeller built empires that rivaled the power of the government itself. In this new America, men did not wear crowns, but their gold bought them influence greater than kings. This era saw the rise of the corporation, the triumph of the market, and the emergence of the United States as an economic powerhouse. Stock exchanges buzzed with activity, fortunes were made and lost in a day, and innovation became the currency of power. The telegraph connected cities at the speed of thought, electricity lit up the night, factories churned out goods with mechanical precision. To many, it seemed the future had arrived. But beneath the shimmer of wealth, the masses toiled. Immigrants flooded into Ellis Island by the millions, Italian, Irish, Polish, Chinese, dreaming of a better life and finding instead the choking grip of tenement housing, 12-hour workdays, and pay so meager it barely kept food on the table. Children worked beside their parents in coal mines and textile mills. Laborers built the railroads and manned the furnaces but had little share in the riches they created. They lived in company towns where wages were spent in company stores, trapped in cycles of debt and dependence. The divide between rich and poor widened into a chasm. While the elite dined in mansions along Fifth Avenue and threw lavish parties dripping in opulence, millions lived in slums, drank from poisoned water, and died from preventable diseases. The American dream, it seemed, was reserved for the few. Yet even in the shadow of this inequality, resistance stirred. Labor movements began to rise, often violently suppressed, yet unyielding. Strikes swept through factories and railroads. Workers demanded not revolution, but dignity, a fair wage, a safe workplace, a voice in the machine they powered. The Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor, and other unions took root, pushing back against the unchecked power of industry. Meanwhile, corruption seeped into the very bones of democracy. City bosses, backed by industrial tycoons, traded votes for favors. Political machines like Tammany Hall thrived. Senators were bought and sold like shares of stock. The government, so recently remade in Reconstruction, bent once again toward the powerful. And yet, amidst the smoke and shadows, the nation grew. Its population surged. Its cities became marvels of architecture and innovation. Its economy dwarfed those of Europe. There was pride in progress, even if it came at a cost few were willing to count. The Gilded Age built the bones of modern America, its infrastructure, its corporate foundations, its global ambitions. But it also planted seeds of discontent. The glint of prosperity could not forever blind the eyes of those left behind. The cries of the workers, the journalists who exposed the rot, the reformers who whispered of justice, all were rising. The age had gilded the nation in gold, but cracks were beginning to show. The question that loomed over this bright, brutal era was not whether America could grow. It was whether that growth could be shared, or whether the cage of inequality would one day shatter from within. Part 9, The Progressive Pulse, Reforming a Runaway Republic. The shine of the Gilded Age could not mask its corrosion forever. By the turn of the 20th century, the rising tide of industry had left millions mired in poverty while a small handful ruled with unchecked power. But even as monopolies grew and political machines entrenched themselves, a different current began to stir beneath the surface, a restless thrum of outrage, of hope, of people determined to reclaim a republic that seemed to be slipping from their grasp. This was the Progressive Era, and it arrived not with thunder but with persistence, pushing into the cracks of a fractured system until reform could no longer be denied. The movement had no single face. It was a mosaic of voices, journalists, scholars, laborers, women, immigrants, each demanding that America live up to its own promises. The press took up the torch, exposing the inner rot of corruption and abuse. Muckrakers like Ida Tarbell dismantled the myth of Rockefeller's empire with meticulous prose, while Upton Sinclair's The Jungle peeled back the curtain on the horrors of the meatpacking industry, revealing not only disease-ridden products but the brutal toll on human bodies behind the machinery. Their words did more than inform, they stirred the public conscience. Outrage became action. New laws were proposed, new leaders emerged. Presidents like Theodore Roosevelt stepped forward with the confidence of a reformer and the will of a warrior. Though born of elite stock, Roosevelt saw the dangers of unbridled capitalism and took the bold step of challenging the trusts, wielding the Sherman Antitrust Act like a scalpel against corporate behemoths. He was not against wealth, but against its abuse. Under his square deal, fairness began to take root in policy. Railroads were regulated. Food and drugs were inspected. The wilderness, so often plundered in the name of progress, was shielded under a new vision of conservation. National parks and forests became sanctuaries for future generations, protected not for profit but for posterity. Yet the movement did not stop at nature or monopoly. It marched into cities where slums festered and children labored. It entered factories and schools and courthouses. Women, long confined to the margins of political life, demanded suffrage not as charity but as a right. The voices of activists like Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul grew louder, more insistent, carried by decades of quiet resolve now blossoming into public protest. Education reformers pushed for broader access to schooling. Urban planners sought to replace filth and chaos with light and order. Public health advocates brought sanitation to the forefront, reducing infant mortality and curbing the spread of disease in America's swelling cities. But not all was noble or pure. The progressive movement bore contradictions. While it sought justice, it sometimes embraced paternalism. While fighting for reform, it excluded many from its vision, particularly African Americans, whose rights were still brutally denied, especially in the South. Segregation persisted. Lynchings went unpunished. The dream of equality, so central to progressivism's ideals, remained unevenly distributed. Still, the movement endured because its foundation was not perfection but momentum. It was the belief that the arc of history, while long and winding, could be nudged toward justice by the hands of ordinary citizens. It understood that democracy was not a gift passed down from on high, but a muscle that required constant flexing, constant vigilance. By the 1910s, the political landscape had begun to shift. New amendments were written into the Constitution, some expanding rights, others limiting them. The direct election of senators, the income tax, prohibition, and eventually women's suffrage all found their place in law. America was trying, unevenly and imperfectly, to remake itself from the inside out. This era did not solve every problem. It did not end inequality or erase corruption. But it did something perhaps more powerful: it reawakened the citizen's role in shaping the republic. The progressive pulse, once faint, now beat loud in the heart of the nation. And as a new century dawned, America stood on the edge of a world that was changing faster than even its reformers could imagine. Part 10, Thunder Across the Ocean, America and the First World War. It began, as world-changing things often do, with a bullet fired far away. In the summer of 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne fell to an assassin's gun in Sarajevo, and like a spark in dry grass, the old world erupted into war. At first, it seemed distant to Americans, another European squabble, something to be watched with curiosity and perhaps caution, but not alarm. President Woodrow Wilson urged neutrality, believing that the United States, separated by oceans and bound by ideals, could stand apart from the maelstrom. But the thunder over Europe did not stay on the far side of the Atlantic for long. The world had changed. This was not the age of cavalry charges and courtly declarations. This was the age of machine guns, mustard gas, barbed wire, and steel rain falling from the sky. The war dug deep into the soil of Europe and refused to let go. And even across the ocean, America could feel the tremors. Ships were sunk. Lives were lost. Commerce disrupted. More than that, something fundamental shifted in the American psyche. The idea of isolation, so long a comfort, began to feel like a luxury the New World could no longer afford. By 1917, the tide had turned. German submarines prowled the Atlantic without restraint, and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal to ally with Mexico against the United States, was the final fracture in Wilson's restraint. With solemn gravity, he asked Congress for a declaration of war, not in pursuit of conquest but to make the world safe for democracy. The words rang lofty, but the reality awaiting American soldiers in the trenches of Europe was anything but. Young men from farms, factories, and city streets were shipped across the ocean, thrown into a conflict that had already chewed up a generation. The U.S. Army was still small when the war began, underfunded and underprepared. But American industry rose like a sleeping giant. The arsenal of democracy began to stir. Trains, rifles, boots, uniforms, food, oil, ships, an entire nation mobilized. And the world noticed. When the American expeditionary forces arrived in France, led by the steely General John J. Pershing, they brought not only fresh bodies but a sense of morale to weary Allied lines. Lafayette, "We are here," proclaimed Colonel Charles Stanton at the tomb of the French hero of the American Revolution, a symbolic repayment of a centuries-old debt. The doughboys fought with grit in battles like Belleau and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, forging their legacy in the mud and fire of Europe's war-torn fields. At home, the war redrew the contours of American society. Women stepped into factory roles. Black Americans, drawn north by the promise of work and dignity, began what became known as the Great Migration. But even as the nation united in war, tensions simmered. Civil liberties shrank under the weight of the Espionage Act. Dissent was punished. Immigrants, especially those of German descent, found themselves suddenly suspect. And then, as quickly as it had escalated, the war began to sputter. Exhausted by years of bloodshed, Germany capitulated. The armistice came on November 11, 1918, and the guns fell silent. America had tipped the balance, and now the world looked to it, not merely as a participant, but as a power. At Versailles, Wilson arrived with a grand vision, a League of Nations that would preserve peace through collective diplomacy. But his dream faltered, not on the world stage, but at home. The U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty. America, having just stepped onto the global stage, stumbled back again, wary of entanglements. The war had changed everything, but it had not yet convinced Americans they were destined to lead. Still, something irreversible had begun. The war marked the beginning of America's rise, not just as an industrial powerhouse, but as a moral voice, a military force, and a nation whose decisions would ripple across oceans. The thunder across the ocean had called America to act. And though it tried to retreat, the echo followed. Because once the world has heard your footsteps on its stage, it never forgets the sound. Part 11, Boom, Bust, and the Roar of the Twenties. When the guns fell silent in Europe, the world exhaled, and America roared. The 1920s arrived like a gale, sweeping away the soot of war with the jazz of jubilation. Soldiers returned not to solemnity but to spectacle. Cities buzzed with electricity, literally and figuratively. Neon signs began to glow above speakeasies, movie palaces, and department stores. A new rhythm took hold of the American spirit, syncopated, restless, hungry. At the heart of it all was a paradox. The war had scarred the old world, but it had enriched the new. Europe's industries lay shattered, America's had boomed. The nation emerged from the war stronger, more confident, and infused with a belief that its future was not just bright, it was boundless. In factories and assembly lines, machines hummed with a newfound purpose. Henry Ford's moving assembly line revolutionized production and made the automobile, once a luxury for the elite, a staple of the middle class. The Model T wasn't just a car, it was a promise of freedom, mobility, and progress. Wall Street soared. Banks expanded. Credit flowed. And with it, consumerism was born in earnest. Radios brought jazz and baseball into homes. Advertisements promised beauty, success, and happiness in the shape of a cigarette, a vacuum cleaner, or a flapper's perfume. Women had tasted independence during the war, and now they demanded more. The vote was won in 1920, and with it came a new image, the flapper. She danced, smoked, wore her hair short and her hemlines high. She wasn't waiting for the world to change, she was changing with it. But not all was freewheeling rebellion. Beneath the gloss and glamour, the decade pulsed with contradiction. Prohibition, ratified in 1920, aimed to cleanse the soul of the nation by banning alcohol. Instead, it birthed a dark underbelly, bootleggers, speakeasies, gangsters. Al Capone became both feared and admired, the ultimate symbol of how America's appetite for freedom could twist into lawlessness. In the heartland, cultural tremors echoed the urban roar. The Scopes trial in 1925 was more than a courtroom drama over teaching evolution, it was a duel between modernity and tradition, science and scripture. The Ku Klux Klan reemerged, not only in the South but across the Midwest, preaching hate in the name of patriotism. Immigration quotas hardened. The Red Scare stoked fears that Bolsheviks lurked in union halls and college lecture rooms. Progress danced with prejudice in a strange, jarring rhythm. Yet for many, it still felt like a golden age. Harlem pulsed with a renaissance of black culture, poetry, jazz, art, and defiance. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Duke Ellington weren't just entertaining, they were redefining what it meant to be American. In the West, Hollywood bloomed. Silent stars like Charlie Chaplin and Clara Bow captivated millions, and by the end of the decade, the talkies began to speak. Then, just as quickly as it all had crescendoed, the music stopped. On an October morning in 1929, the stock market cracked like thin ice. Prices plummeted. Fortunes vanished in a blink. Bankers, once gods of prosperity, now leapt from buildings. It wasn't merely a financial collapse, it was a spiritual one. The dream that America's boom could never end was exposed for what it was: fragile, inflated, and mortal. But the full weight of that collapse would come later. For now, as the curtain fell on the 1920s, the jazz still echoed faintly. The nation stood at the precipice of something it didn't yet understand. The Roaring Twenties had roared indeed, bold, brash, brilliant. But as the decade turned, America would learn that even the loudest parties end in silence. Part 12, The Great Depression, When the Dream Collapsed. It began with a silence more profound than any explosion. One by one, ticker tapes ceased their frenzied clatter, and the once humming nerves of Wall Street went eerily quiet. October 1929 was not merely a date, it was a rupture in the American psyche. The crash of the stock market did not just topple financial empires, it shattered the illusion that progress was inevitable. In the blink of a few days, fortunes dissolved like morning mist, and the Roaring Twenties were replaced by the hush of despair. But the true depth of the crisis would take months to reveal itself. Bank doors slammed shut across small towns and major cities, and inside, ordinary people pounded on the marble walls, demanding access to savings that no longer existed. Farmers watched helplessly as the prices for their wheat and corn sank below the cost of production. Urban workers lined up for jobs that no longer needed hands. By the winter of 1930, bread lines stretched for blocks and soup kitchens became more familiar than family kitchens. What made it worse was the absence of an immediate lifeline. President Herbert Hoover, bound by a philosophy of limited government and rugged individualism, hesitated. He believed the market would right itself, that charity and local solutions could patch the gaping wound. But America was bleeding faster than bandages could hold. Hoovervilles, makeshift shantytowns, rose in the shadows of empty skyscrapers. Men stood on street corners selling apples for a nickel, not as vendors but as former bankers, teachers, engineers. Entire families drifted across the countryside in search of work, food, or simply hope. And then came the wind. On the Great Plains, years of aggressive farming had stripped the soil bare. When drought arrived, it turned earth to dust. Storms blackened the sky, turning day into night and burying homes under dunes of dirt. Children coughed up mud from their lungs, and families boarded up windows with wet sheets, hoping to keep the filth out. The Dust Bowl wasn't just an ecological disaster, it was a symbol of a broken promise. The American land, once mythologized as generous and boundless, had turned against its people. Amidst this, voices of anger and voices of vision began to rise. The radio became a battleground of ideologies. Father Coughlin thundered populist fury over the airwaves. Huey Long promised a share our wealth plan that frightened both Wall Street and Washington. Communists, socialists, and capitalists debated not just policy, but the very meaning of America itself. Yet even in the darkness, some lights refused to die out. Communities leaned on each other in new ways. Neighbors pooled food. Families shared rooms with distant cousins. Musicians wrote sorrow into their songs. Woody Guthrie strummed tales of dust and survival, while swing music offered fleeting moments of joy. Hollywood, too, adapted. Escapism took root in the cinemas, where audiences could forget breadlines and broken dreams for a few hours, watching Fred Astaire tap dance through the clouds. And then, from the political storm clouds, a new voice emerged. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised not perfection, but action. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, he declared, and for the first time in years, the country exhaled. It would not be easy. It would not be swift. But under Roosevelt, the government would reach into the lives of ordinary Americans with a breadth never seen before. Relief. Recovery. Reform. Words that would come to define a new chapter, one where the state would stand not above the people, but beside them. The Great Depression did more than collapse the economy. It humbled the nation. It taught the richest country on earth that its strength was not just in wealth, but in resilience. And that the American dream, while fragile, could be rebuilt, not from the top down, but from the hands of its people. Part 13, The New Deal, A Government Reimagined. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt stepped into office in March of 1933, the country he inherited was teetering on the brink of collapse. Banks were failing at a rate of hundreds per week, millions were jobless, and trust in both capitalism and democracy had withered like crops in the Dust Bowl winds. Yet there stood FDR, confident and composed, his cigarette holder tilted with characteristic flair, speaking not as a distant politician but as a neighbor at the hearth. His voice, calm and deliberate, spread across the nation via radio, those fireside chats knitting together a fractured republic with the invisible thread of hope. The New Deal wasn't a single policy, it was a sweeping reimagination of the relationship between government and its citizens. It was a lifeboat in churning waters, but also a blueprint for a new kind of America, one where the federal government would not simply referee the game of capitalism, but step onto the field itself. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt launched a legislative barrage that stunned even seasoned politicians. Agencies sprang to life like seeds in spring. The CCC sent young men to replant forests and build trails. The WPA put artists to work painting murals in post offices and writing guidebooks for forgotten towns. The TVA harnessed the power of rivers to bring light to valleys that had never known electricity. To the unemployed, these programs were more than acronyms. They were bread on the table, roofs over heads, and dignity where shame had taken root. For the first time, the American government didn't just speak of the people, it reached out to touch them, to build with them, to walk beside them. Skeptics in the business world balked. Conservatives warned of creeping socialism. But for millions who had waited in soup lines, the New Deal was not ideology, it was survival. Roosevelt was no radical. He did not seek to dismantle capitalism but to save it from its own excesses. The stock market, once a casino for the reckless rich, was brought under regulation. The FDIC promised that Americans' bank deposits would no longer vanish like smoke. The Social Security Act of 1935 stood out like a lighthouse, offering, for the first time, a promise to the elderly that they would not face destitution in the twilight of their lives. It was a quiet revolution in policy and spirit. The government, once aloof, now stood as a guarantor, not of wealth, but of worth. And yet, the New Deal did not reach all with equal force. For Black Americans in the South, discrimination was baked into the structure of many programs. Farm workers and domestic laborers, roles heavily filled by minorities, were excluded from key protections. The patriarchy remained largely untouched, with women often relegated to the margins of economic recovery. The New Deal, in its brilliance, also revealed its blind spots. Still, the mood of the country changed. Towns with new schools, roads, and electricity bore silent testimony to transformation. Public art blossomed across federal buildings. Folk songs and photographs captured the faces of both struggle and endurance. In classrooms, children once too cold or hungry to learn sat in desks with full bellies and books provided by government aid. The Supreme Court tried to halt the tide, striking down some key initiatives. Roosevelt, frustrated but strategic, pushed for judicial reform. Though his infamous court-packing plan failed politically, the court's resistance softened. The arc bent forward again. By the late 1930s, the economy had begun to sputter back to life, not with the roar of the 1920s, but with a steady breath of resilience. Perhaps the New Deal's greatest legacy wasn't in the programs themselves but in what they taught the American public, that democracy could be responsive, that government could be a tool of collective good, not just an instrument of taxation or warfare. It carved into the soul of the country a belief that despair need not be permanent, that policy could be a poem, and that even the most battered society could find its rhythm again. When the next storm came, as it would, from across the oceans, America would not be caught unaware. It had already rebuilt itself once. The scaffolding of solidarity had been erected. And a generation who had once stood in breadlines would now be called upon to stand for the world. Part 14, Shadows of War, America on the Brink Again. By the end of the 1930s, the thunder of distant guns could once again be heard across the Atlantic, muffled by ocean and hope, but unmistakable. The world was unraveling. In Europe, Hitler had clawed his way from failed artist to dictator, draping Germany in swastikas and vengeance. In the East, Japan marched through China with brutal ambition, its imperial soldiers staining the soil with conquest. And in Italy, Mussolini flexed fascist muscle in North Africa, dreaming of a resurrected Roman Empire. The global order, fragile since the armistice of 1918, was cracking. And though the United States still reeled from its own economic turmoil, the clouds gathering overseas could no longer be ignored. But America was not eager for another war. Memories of the Great War were too fresh, of young men swallowed by trenches, of families who never fully healed, of promises broken. Isolationism was not just a policy, it was a national mood. Congress passed neutrality acts. Protesters decried foreign entanglements. Even Roosevelt, whose instincts pulled toward intervention, tread carefully. His speeches struck a delicate balance, recognizing the dangers abroad while reassuring a wary nation that peace remained his aim. Still, beneath the surface, the tide was shifting. Americans watched as cities in Europe fell like dominoes, as bombs rained down on London, as Hitler carved a path through Poland, France, and beyond. Radio broadcasts crackled with news from across the Atlantic, and though the names were foreign, Danzig, Dunkirk, Vichy, the implications were chillingly familiar. Democracy was under siege. And though the Atlantic was vast, it was not impenetrable. Roosevelt began to prepare, slowly at first, then with more urgency. The nation's factories, once idle, hummed to life under the promise of rearmament. The peacetime draft, the first in American history, called young men to duty, not for war, but for readiness. Lend-Lease was passed, sending aid to Britain and, later, to the Soviet Union. Roosevelt's fireside chats took on a new tone, less about banks and jobs, more about freedom and its price. In every corner of the country, whispers of war began to echo louder. Mothers held their sons a little longer. Workers wondered if their new jobs at the shipyards or arms plants would one day link them to distant battlefields. The movies, once filled with dancing and romance, now flickered with tales of spies and submarines. Children played games with helmets made of pots. The sense of waiting, of something inevitable, settled over the land like the stillness before a storm. There were voices, loud ones, urging caution. Charles Lindbergh, the nation's aviation hero, warned of Jewish influence and foreign manipulation, joining the America First Committee in opposition to Roosevelt's support of Britain. Debates raged in newspapers, in Congress, around dinner tables. Was this America's fight? Hadn't the last war solved nothing? Shouldn't charity begin at home? But even as the nation wrestled with its conscience, history was writing its next chapter in fire. On December 7, 1941, the question was answered in a blaze of torpedoes and black smoke. Pearl Harbor was struck without warning. Battleships listed, flames rose, and in the sudden violence of that morning, a nation that had walked so carefully along the edge of conflict found itself thrown into the abyss. Roosevelt's voice, steady and grim, addressed Congress the next day, calling it a date which would live in infamy. And in that moment, America's long hesitation ended. The shadow that had loomed over the world now passed directly overhead. Isolationism crumbled, patriotism surged, and an industrial giant shook off the last dust of the Depression to become a war machine. Young men lined up at recruiting stations. Women stepped into factories. The country transformed itself with startling speed. But before the bullets flew, before the tanks rolled across Europe and the Pacific Islands echoed with gunfire, there had been this chapter, this twilight before the storm. A time of uncertainty, of reluctance, of grappling with the question that would define a generation: when evil rises beyond your borders, how long can you pretend it won't reach your own? Part 15, Arsenal of Democracy, the Home Front Awakens. The moment America declared war, a dormant giant stirred. The slumbering fields of wheat and rusted factory belts of the Great Depression snapped to attention, and within weeks, the country was no longer just a participant in the Second World War, it was its furnace. From Detroit to Pittsburgh, from San Francisco to Boston, assembly lines once built for refrigerators and radios now churned out tanks, planes, and bullets. The transformation was not merely industrial, it was spiritual. A fractured, uncertain nation found unity in steel, sweat, and sacrifice. President Roosevelt, ever the orator, had called the United States the arsenal of democracy, and now that phrase echoed in every shipyard and warehouse. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler turned their engineers loose not on new car models, but on bomber blueprints. Entire factories sprang up almost overnight, like Willow Run in Michigan, a mile-long temple of war production that would eventually produce a B-24 bomber every hour. Rosie the Riveter became more than a poster, she was real. Millions of women who had never stepped foot in a machine shop now worked with precision and pride, tightening bolts on Liberty ships and welding armor on Sherman tanks. Children collected scrap metal and rubber, proud to trade marbles for ration stamps. Housewives organized neighborhood drives. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards and on rooftops, feeding both bodies and morale. Gasoline was measured in coupons, sugar came in small bags, and everyone, it seemed, learned how to do with less. Sacrifice became a badge of honor, and inconvenience was a national bond. Yet it was not only a time of unity. The war exposed fault lines too. Japanese Americans on the West Coast, some third-generation citizens, were herded into internment camps under Executive Order 9066. Stripped of their property and dignity, they watched from behind barbed wire as the country they loved fought fascism abroad while flirting with authoritarianism at home. African Americans, despite contributing mightily to the war effort, still faced discrimination in hiring, housing, and service. The Double V campaign emerged, a cry for victory over fascism overseas and racism at home. Still, despite injustice and inequality, the engine of America thundered to life. The war offered millions a paycheck, a purpose, and a future. For many Black Americans, the factories of Chicago and Cleveland became places not just of labor, but of migration and transformation. For women, the rivet gun meant not just economic contribution, but identity and pride beyond the apron. For immigrants and the children of immigrants, donning a uniform meant claiming ownership of an American story they had long been told was not quite theirs. The U.S. was now the logistical heartbeat of the Allied war machine. Lend-Lease shipments poured out of its ports, tanks to Russia, rations to Britain, uniforms for resistance fighters in North Africa. Convoys steamed across the Atlantic under threat of German U-boats, their holds brimming with the raw proof that America was no longer neutral, no longer passive. What was being fought on distant shores was also being won, or lost, on the loading docks of Baltimore, the smokestacks of Ohio, the railroad lines crisscrossing the continent. And then there was the science. In secret corners of the nation, brilliant minds gathered in labs and deserts, racing to unlock the destructive force of the atom. The Manhattan Project, hidden in plain sight, was perhaps the clearest sign that this war was total. Not just a war of guns and flags, but of knowledge, ambition, and dread. At Los Alamos, the future was being forged atom by atom, and no one yet knew whether it would save the world or destroy it. By 1944, America was producing half the world's weapons. It wasn't just the arsenal of democracy, it had become democracy's foundry, its bank, its backbone. The war, for all its horror, had transformed the country. The Depression had been buried in production quotas and overtime shifts. The federal government now touched nearly every aspect of daily life. And the people, for all their doubts and divisions, had largely answered the call. The battlefield would still determine the outcome. But without the humming engines and midnight shifts of the American home front, the war's story might have been very different. It was here, in sweat-soaked shirts and calloused hands, that victory was soldered together. Not with rifles, but with rivets. Part 16, Normandy and Beyond, The March to Victory. Before the dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy, the world seemed to hold its breath. For months, Europe had waited for a liberation long promised but never fully revealed. And now, in the quiet hours of June 6, 1944, the greatest armada in history crept across the English Channel, 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, nearly 160,000 soldiers, an industrial and human tide aimed at breaking Hitler's grip on the continent. D-Day was not just a battle, it was the thunderclaps signaling a long and bloody march toward the end. The Americans landed on Utah and Omaha, the British and Canadians on Gold, Juno, and Sword. At Omaha, the water ran red. German machine guns, dug into cliffs and bunkers, raked the surf with bullets. The tide brought not just soldiers but bodies, broken equipment, prayers, and chaos. It was a storm of noise and fear, of courage and disarray. And yet, inch by inch, foot by foot, the Allies pressed inland. Normandy was not a single day of triumph but weeks of mud, hedgerows, and resistance. The Bocage country slowed tanks, funneled infantry, and gave the defenders every advantage. Towns like Cannes, St. Lo, and Corentin became names etched into memory through fire and loss. American paratroopers who had dropped behind enemy lines in the pre-dawn dark now fought with pistols, knives, and whatever they could salvage. The price was staggering, but by late summer, Paris was free. And with liberation came the realization that this was not just a military campaign, it was a moral reckoning. The French wept in the streets. Girls placed flowers in the barrels of rifles. Old men embraced young soldiers. And yet, for every cheering civilian, there was the lingering smoke of what war had taken. Entire villages had vanished. Fields once green with wheat now bloomed only with craters and crosses. From Normandy, the Allies surged forward. Through Belgium, into the Netherlands, across rivers like the Meuse and the Rhine. But the path was not a straight one. Operation Market Garden, a bold attempt to leapfrog German defenses via airborne assault, ended in bitter failure. The winter brought the Battle of the Bulge, a last, desperate German counterattack that surrounded American troops in Bastogne. Snow fell as shells exploded. Men froze in foxholes, their feet rotting from cold, their letters home unread. Yet again, the American spirit proved unbroken. General Patton's Third Army cut through the storm, relieved Bastogne, and pushed back the tide. By spring, the Allied lines moved like a juggernaut. Cities like Cologne and Frankfurt fell. The Germans retreated, not with order, but with dread. The Reich was unraveling. And then the camps were found. In Buchenwald, in Dachau, in countless places hidden in forests and behind barbed wire, the liberation brought not victory but horror. Starved bodies. Eyes too hollow to comprehend freedom. American soldiers who had trained for warfare now found themselves bearing witness to the industrial scale of evil. The war, once framed in strategy and maps, now became deeply personal. The fight had never just been against a regime, it had been against the abyss. By May 1945, Hitler was dead, Berlin in ruins, and Europe no longer shackled. VE Day brought celebration, but also exhaustion. The war in Europe was over, but the Pacific still burned. For the Americans, the march to victory had been bought with blood. Every hedgerow, every trench, every village liberated had cost something irreplaceable. Friends, limbs, innocence. But also something else had been forged, confidence. The United States had proven it could cross oceans not only with bombs, but with ideals. It had liberated, not occupied. It had built bridges, not empires. And with that, it stood not only as a victor, but as something new. A superpower. The war had given it the tools, technology, industry, unity. The world had seen America at its strongest, and now, it would turn to it in the fragile peace to come. The march to victory was not just about defeating tyranny. It was the prelude to leadership on a scale never before imagined. Part 17, The Atom and the End, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the New World. It began with silence, then came the flash. On August 6, 1945, At precisely 8:15 a.m., the sky over Hiroshima cracked open with a light unlike any ever seen before. A single American bomber, the Enola Gay, had flown high above the sleeping city. Below, people were beginning their morning routines, schoolchildren walking, workers pedaling to factories, mothers drawing water from wells. In one blinding instant, time itself seemed to melt. The atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, detonated with the force of over 15,000 tons of TNT. A fireball rose like a second sun. Buildings vaporized. Shadows burned into walls. The air ignited and turned into a searing wave that flattened the city and scorched the earth. Where once there had been streets and families and the bustle of everyday life, there was now only rubble, flame, and an unspeakable stillness. Tens of thousands died instantly. Tens of thousands more would follow, some slowly, some without explanation, sickened by a force no human could yet understand. 3 days later, on August 9th, Nagasaki became the second city to face nuclear destruction. It had not been the original target, clouds had obscured Kokura, but fate shifted, and Nagasaki bore the weight of Fat Man, the second bomb. The explosion was more powerful, but the terrain, mountains cradling the city, blunted the scale of devastation. Still, thousands perished in another flash of irreversible fire. These were not merely military decisions, nor were they simply acts of war. They were moments that would define the course of human history. The Manhattan Project, born in secret and forged by the minds of America's greatest scientists, had unlocked a terrible power. The bomb did more than end the war with Japan, it forced the world into a new reality. The age of nuclear weapons had begun. For Japan, the bombs brought surrender. Emperor Hirohito addressed his people via radio, his voice, most of them had never heard before, telling them to endure the unendurable. On August 15, 1945, the war was over. The bloodshed had finally stopped. But no one could look at the sky quite the same again. In the aftermath, there was celebration, certainly, people danced in the streets, kissed strangers in Times Square, and wept with relief. But there was also something else, something more complicated, unease. What had been created could not be unmade. What had been unleashed could not be put back. The atomic age had arrived, and with it came the burden of unimaginable responsibility. America had emerged from World War II not just victorious, but transformed. It alone possessed the atom bomb, a weapon so powerful that it effectively rendered conventional war obsolete between great powers. The very balance of the world now teetered not on armies, but on deterrence. The Cold War had not yet officially begun, but the chill was already in the air. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, life struggled to return. Survivors, hibakusha, carried not just physical scars but spiritual ones. Children were born with deformities. Water was feared. Rain was suspect. For decades, silence hung over those cities like a ghost. What had happened was so vast, so incomprehensible, that words often failed. And yet, the survivors endured. They rebuilt. They told their stories. The world watched and listened. Some called the bombs necessary, others called them war crimes. But all agreed, they had changed everything. They had shown humanity its own reflection in a terrible new mirror. And once seen, it could not be unseen. For America, the bomb was both a triumph of science and a test of conscience. It had ended one war, but begun a new kind of arms race. No longer was power measured solely in territory or industry, but in kilotons, in missiles, in seconds until midnight. Presidents, generals, and scientists alike would wrestle with that knowledge for generations to come. Thus, from the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rose not just a new world, but a new kind of fear, and with it, a fragile hope. A hope that such destruction would never again be necessary. A hope that knowledge, once unshackled, might still serve peace. But deep down, everyone knew. The genie was out of the bottle. And the world would never be the same. Part 18, The Coldest War, America and the Soviet Shadow. It was a war without front lines, without declarations, and, mercifully, without mushroom clouds, though their threat loomed large over every conversation, every handshake, every glance across a border. After the last shots of World War II echoed into silence, a new conflict crept into being. It was colder, more calculating, waged in the minds of leaders, the vaults of spies, the lecture halls of ideology, and the chill winds that swept through Berlin's divided streets. The Soviet Union, rising from the ashes of its brutal war with Germany, had not been America's enemy in the trenches, but the alliance had always been uneasy. Stalin's ambition stretched as far west as Roosevelt's optimism stretched east. And when Europe lay shattered and empty of certainty, the world's two great survivors, the capitalist experiment and the communist revolution, locked eyes across the ruins. Each saw in the other not merely a rival, but an existential threat. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine gave this conflict a name: containment. The idea was simple, the implications vast. Communism was to be checked, hemmed in, never allowed to spread its roots beyond where it already clung. And so, America began building invisible fences, military aid, covert operations, economic support, to box in the red tide. Greece, Turkey, Korea, Vietnam, Cuba. The map became a chessboard, every square vital, every move shadowed by the possibility of nuclear consequence. And then there was Germany, split like a cracked mirror. Berlin, its heart, became a flashpoint where freedom and tyranny stared each other down from opposite street corners. The Berlin airlift of 1948-49 became America's answer to Soviet provocation, a feat of logistics and resolve, a quiet symbol that food, fuel, and willpower could defeat a blockade as surely as bombs. It was a victory not of violence, but of perseverance. The arms race followed, its logic chilling in its simplicity. To avoid being destroyed, one must be able to destroy utterly. So America tested, stockpiled, and deployed. The Soviets responded in kind. The skies above buzzed with reconnaissance aircraft and the deep oceans below held submarines cradling apocalypse. Schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills. Civilians built fallout shelters in their backyards, as if a few feet of dirt could save them from firestorms and radiation. Fear became a fixture. It nested in living rooms, whispered on television screens, echoed in the click of typewriters and the hum of shortwave radios. Hollywood made enemies of Soviets. Politicians made enemies of neighbors. The Red Scare took hold. Loyalty was measured not in deeds, but in denials. Careers vanished. Lives were broken. America, born of liberty, now wrestled with paranoia. And yet, even amid this shadow struggle, brilliance bloomed. Science soared. Rockets reached for space. Computers, once the size of rooms, began shrinking into something more intimate. The same forces that threatened the world also redefined it. The Cold War, for all its frost, became an engine of technology, of ideology, of identity. Presidents came and went, each navigating the uneasy dance. Eisenhower's steady hand. Kennedy's bold defiance in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nixon's opening to China. Reagan's fiery rhetoric and cautious diplomacy. Behind closed doors and across open stages, the chess game played on, each move laced with uncertainty. But in the end, it was not a missile or a march that cracked the Iron Curtain. It was something quieter. A weariness. A longing. A recognition, perhaps, that the promises of revolution had failed to warm the Russian winter. That freedom, imperfect and flawed, still offered something real. In 1989, the Berlin Wall crumbled, not from a bomb, but from the breath of history exhaled at last. By 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. Flags changed. Maps shifted. And America stood, momentarily, unchallenged on the world stage. The Cold War had ended not with a bang, but with a silence that felt unfamiliar. But victory came at a cost. Trillions spent. Millions traumatized. A planet changed by the constant shadow of extinction. And in that long, strange peace, America had been shaped, not just by what it fought, but by how it learned to live with the tension of the abyss. The Cold War was over, But its echoes remained. Part 19, Prosperity and Pressure, America in the Golden Age. The war was over, and the soldiers came home to a nation that felt both familiar and transformed. From the smoldering ruins of global conflict, America emerged unscathed on its own soil, industrially invigorated, economically primed, and brimming with confidence. It was a nation on the rise, its cities bustling, its suburbs sprawling, its people reaching for televisions, automobiles, and the American dream as if they were birthrights handed down from victory. This was the Golden Age, or so it seemed. From the late 1940s into the 1960s, America embraced a heady cocktail of hope and consumption. There were homes to be built, families to raise, highways to pave, and futures to dream into being. The GI Bill offered returning veterans access to education and housing. A generation of Americans, once bloodied by war, now found themselves awash in opportunity. With every new tracked home and chrome-trimmed car, the illusion of boundless prosperity grew. Television became the hearth of the modern household. Families gathered nightly not just to be entertained but to be shaped, by images, by ideals, by stories of what America was and what it should be. News of Elvis Presley's gyrating hips, the suburban dream of Leave It to Beaver, or the confident smile of a president in his televised debate became the cultural signposts of a society building itself in real time. Yet beneath the polished veneer, tension simmered. Not all shared equally in the prosperity. For Black Americans in the South, segregation still dictated where they could live, eat, and vote. The promise of liberty echoed hollow in cities where redlining drew invisible walls, and opportunity stopped at color lines. In the shadows of prosperity, a civil rights movement gathered its strength, not through force, but through courage and conviction. Rosa Parks stayed seated. Dr. King marched with a voice that stirred even those who wished not to hear. In schools and lunch counters, on buses and bridges, a new kind of war was waged, not for territory, but for dignity. And as white America watched it unfold on nightly television, the nation was forced to reckon with the truth that prosperity had not been shared. Meanwhile, women, too, began questioning the roles they had been hurried back into after the war. The Rosie the Riveters of the 1940s, once proud and empowered, were told to return to kitchens and cribs. But the seed had been planted. The glossy magazines might have said otherwise, but many women looked around their tidy suburban lives and wondered if fulfillment really came from gleaming appliances and quiet obedience. And then there was the youth, born into comfort but stirred by curiosity. In coffeehouses and on college campuses, the seeds of counterculture were sown. It began with questions. It would not end there. Abroad, the Cold War shadow never quite lifted. The Korean War reminded the nation that peace was fragile. Nuclear drills in classrooms, whispered fears of communism, and the ever-present question, what if tomorrow ends in a flash, kept the dream of security from ever fully settling into reality. And yet, even amid unrest and uncertainty, America innovated. NASA reached toward the stars. Polio met its match in a vaccine. Jazz evolved. Literature flourished. From diners to department stores, the country pulsed with creativity and contradictions, freedom and fear. The Golden Age was real. It built roads, launched rockets, and lifted millions into the middle class. But it also excluded, silenced, and sometimes forgot. It promised a dream while ignoring the nightmares still faced by many. As the 1960s dawned, the country stood tall but unsteady, its wealth unmatched, its ideals tested, its image polished and yet cracking at the edges. It had become a beacon to the world, but even beacons cast shadows. This was America at its brightest, and at its most fragile. Prosperity had arrived. But pressure was building. Part 20, Civil Rights and the Soul of a Nation. The golden sheen of post-war America was never evenly cast. While some strolled freshly paved suburban sidewalks and watched their children grow in peace, others lived under the burden of exclusion, surveillance, and injustice. For millions of Black Americans, the so-called American dream was still guarded by poll taxes, Jim Crow signs, and the unspoken laws of intimidation and silence. But silence, as the nation would soon learn, does not mean surrender. The mid-20th century brought a reckoning. The rising tide of prosperity had lifted some boats, but not all. In the cotton fields of the Deep South, in the crowded neighborhoods of Chicago and Detroit, in schools divided by race and resources, the gap between America's promises and its practice grew too wide to ignore. It was time, at last, for the country to look in the mirror. In Montgomery, Alabama, a quiet seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to relinquish her seat on a bus. In that small, still act of defiance, a movement found one of its sparks. Across the South, black churches, community centers, and college campuses became command posts for change. Boycotts, sit-ins, and marches followed, not born of hate, but of unyielding faith in justice. A young preacher from Atlanta emerged as the voice of a generation. Martin Luther King Jr., armed not with arms but with scripture and a resonant cadence, spoke of a dream, a nation where character triumphed over color, where justice rolled down like waters. Under his leadership, the civil rights movement took to the streets, to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, to Selma's bloodied bridge. Peaceful protest met with violent resistance revealed to the world the moral contradiction at America's core. But King was not alone. Malcolm X, with a voice as sharp as it was righteous, called out the hypocrisy more bluntly. Medgar Evers organized on the ground, while Fannie Lou Hamer bore witness to the system's cruelty with defiant dignity. Children, too, marched, some jailed, some beaten, some killed. The movement was not abstract, it was bone-deep and blood-earned. Change came, but not without pain. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were milestones, hammered into law by the courage of those who refused to yield. Lyndon B. Johnson, a Southern president shaped by poverty and power, used his platform to push through legislation that many of his peers feared. But even as laws changed, hearts and systems lagged behind. Riots erupted in Watts, Newark, and Detroit, born of frustration that a piece of paper could not erase generations of exclusion. White America, confronted by images of fire hoses, police dogs, and burning neighborhoods, struggled to comprehend the depth of the wound. Some turned away. Others finally turned toward the truth. The soul of the nation, its ideals of liberty, equality, and justice, was being tested in full view. For some, it was a time of awakening, for others, a time of reckoning. Integration was more than a legal concept, it was a demand to re-examine identity, history, and the power structures that had always benefited the few. Beyond Black America, the ripples spread. Latino activists, Native American movements, Asian American coalitions, all began to find their voice in this era of resistance and reclamation. The 1960s became a time when the voiceless were no longer silent. And yet, progress was fragile. Martin Luther King Jr. was felled by a bullet in Memphis. Malcolm X before him. Medgar Evers before that. Hope, always hard-won, was now blood-stained. Still, the march did not end. Because the soul of a nation is not static, it is forged in conflict, in courage, and in the relentless pursuit of what is right. In those years of upheaval, America learned that democracy is not a finished product. It is a practice. A struggle. A promise that must be renewed with every generation. And in the quiet resolve of the marchers, in the chants of children holding hands, in the roar of defiance and the whisper of dreams still deferred, the nation's conscience stirred. The civil rights movement was not a chapter, it was a mirror. And what America chose to see in that mirror would shape the decades to come. Part 21, The Fires of Vietnam, a nation at war with itself. By the mid-1960s, America had become entangled in a conflict half a world away, a war in a dense, unfamiliar jungle where the terrain was unforgiving and the enemy elusive. Vietnam, a sliver of a nation in Southeast Asia, would become the stage for one of the most controversial chapters in American history. But the war wasn't just fought in rice paddies and hamlets. It seeped into the homes, classrooms, and consciences of millions of Americans, igniting a battle between ideals and reality, loyalty and dissent. At first, the war was justified as a line in the sand, an attempt to halt the spread of communism, to honor commitments to allies, to protect a fragile government in Saigon. Presidents from Eisenhower to Kennedy, and then Johnson, steadily escalated involvement, each step framed as a reluctant necessity. Advisors became troops, troops became battalions, and battalions became a war machine that could no longer be easily halted. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 gave Johnson the pretext to wage war without formally declaring it, and soon the jungles of Vietnam thundered with American firepower. But the Vietnamese countryside was not a place that could be easily subdued. The Viet Cong fought with resolve and intimate knowledge of their homeland. Villages became battlegrounds. Civilians suffered. The war became a quagmire, not because of a lack of firepower, but because it was a war without clear victory, without a moral center. The American soldier, often barely out of high school, was dropped into a world of booby traps, napalm, and ghost-like enemies. Some fought valiantly, others broke. All were changed. Back home, the television brought the war into the living room. Every night, the death toll ticked upward, names of places no one could pronounce became symbols of confusion and horror: My Lai, Khe Sanh, Hue. Images of wounded children, burning villages, and body bags challenged the narrative of noble sacrifice. Trust in government began to unravel, and the young, especially, began to ask why. College campuses erupted. Protests grew from whispers to roars. Draft cards burned. Songs of peace became national anthems for a generation seeking answers. The Democratic National Convention in 1968 exploded into chaos as police clashed with demonstrators. The country's faith in itself fractured further with each report of friendly fire, with each new casualty, with each official denial that no longer aligned with the truth. For the first time, patriotism and protest were not easily separated. Was it un-American to question the war, or was it the most American thing one could do? The nation asked itself what loyalty meant when conscience was at stake. And amid the bloodshed abroad and the rage at home, leadership faltered. Lyndon B. Johnson, once the architect of sweeping civil rights reform, saw his presidency consumed by the war. Exhausted and vilified, he chose not to run for re-election. His successor, Richard Nixon, promised peace with honor, but expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos and secret bombings. The trust between the people and their government continued to erode, a slow bleed that would take generations to heal. By the time the last helicopter lifted off the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon in 1975, America had lost more than 58,000 soldiers. Vietnam had lost millions. But more than bodies, what was lost was innocence, the belief that might always made right, that good intentions always yielded good results. America had met its limits, and they were written in the mud of a foreign land and the tear gas of its own streets. Vietnam was not just a war, it was a national identity crisis. It laid bare the contradictions between power and principle, between belief and reality. The scars would linger in the hearts of veterans, in the memories of families, in the pages of history books that would struggle to explain what went wrong. And in its wake, America stood not triumphant, but sobered. No ticker tape parades welcomed soldiers home. The silence that greeted them said more than any speech ever could. Vietnam taught a lesson no nation wants to learn, that strength alone does not guarantee victory, and that the battles within are often harder than those fought abroad. Part 22, Watergate, Trust on Trial. It began with something small, barely a flicker in the national consciousness. A break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., on a warm June night in 1972. A few flashlights, some wiretaps, a handful of men in dark suits. At first glance, it looked like a botched robbery, an amateur hour intrusion. But beneath that surface crack lay a seismic fault line that would eventually split the foundation of American trust in its highest office. President Richard Nixon, riding high after opening relations with China and managing détente with the Soviet Union, seemed unshakable. Yet behind closed doors, a culture of paranoia had taken root in the West Wing, a belief that enemies were everywhere and that the White House was under siege. The burglary wasn't just about political espionage. It was a symptom of a broader sickness, a fear of losing control. As investigative reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein peeled back the layers, their stories in the Washington Post began to form a web of connections that pointed directly to the Oval Office. Still, the White House stonewalled. Nixon, increasingly embattled, denied involvement and framed the scandal as a media witch hunt. But the tapes, those infamous audio recordings he had made of every conversation in the White House, became the ticking time bomb. When the Supreme Court ruled in 1974 that Nixon must hand over the tapes, the evidence was damning. One tape, in particular, the so-called smoking gun, revealed Nixon instructing aides to obstruct the FBI investigation. The illusion of plausible deniability vanished. What followed was not just a political reckoning, it was a constitutional crisis. Facing certain impeachment and mounting pressure from both parties, Nixon did what no American president had done before: he resigned. On August 8, 1974, in a televised address watched by millions, he announced he would step down the next day for the good of the nation. His successor, Gerald Ford, would later pardon him, hoping to heal the wounds of a country too raw to endure a prolonged trial. But the damage had been done. The American people, once reverent of the presidency, emerged cynical and wary. Congress moved swiftly to pass sweeping reforms aimed at curbing executive power, including campaign finance laws and greater oversight of intelligence agencies. The post-Watergate era was one of introspection, one where the myth of infallible leadership was laid bare. Watergate wasn't just a scandal, it was a mirror. It forced Americans to reckon with the fallibility of their institutions, the corruption lurking behind closed doors, and the fragility of public trust. And in that reckoning, the Republic endured, not unscathed, but not broken either. It was a moment when the system bent but did not snap, when the rule of law proved stronger than the ambitions of any one man. It was democracy on trial, and it passed the test. Part 23, Reagan's Revolution, Morning in America. When Ronald Reagan stood before the American people in 1981, he offered more than a political shift, he promised a psychological rebirth. The nation, bruised by Vietnam, demoralized by Watergate, and weary from an economic downturn, was craving clarity, optimism, and direction. With a confident smile and the cadence of a storyteller, Reagan told Americans that it was morning in America again. And many believed him. The 1980s ushered in a conservative wave unlike any seen since the post-war years. Reagan's presidency was built on an unapologetic belief in American exceptionalism, small government, free markets, and individual liberty. To his supporters, he was a restorative force, a man who didn't just lead but reignited a dormant faith in the American dream. To his critics, he was an actor playing a role, masking deregulation and inequality behind a patriotic script. But there was no denying the impact of his performance. The economy, reeling from stagflation and an energy crisis, responded to Reagan's prescription of tax cuts, reduced government spending, except on the military, and deregulation. Reaganomics, as it was dubbed, aimed to lift all boats through supply-side principles, trusting that if businesses and investors thrived, prosperity would trickle down. In practice, the economy rebounded with impressive growth, inflation tamed, and Wall Street boomed. Yet the gap between rich and poor widened, and entire communities were left behind in the fervor of capitalist revival. Internationally, Reagan adopted a bold, confrontational stance. The Cold War, thought by many to be drifting into uneasy détente, flared once more. The Soviet Union, in Reagan's words, was an evil empire, and the United States would meet it with strength, not apology. Defense budgets soared, strategic initiatives like the proposed missile defense system, nicknamed Star Wars, captured imaginations and skepticism alike. Reagan's aggressive rhetoric and build-up alarmed many, but behind the scenes, he would later shift from hawk to negotiator. By the late 1980s, Reagan's meetings with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev marked a pivotal thaw. Together, they signed historic arms reduction treaties, and the world began to feel the trembling of tectonic change behind the Iron Curtain. The ideological confrontation that had defined the second half of the 20th century was winding down, not with an explosion, but with a handshake. Domestically, Reagan's legacy was more complex. He embodied the mythic cowboy president, grinning, resilient, and fiercely independent. But beneath the swagger, challenges brewed, the AIDS crisis, largely ignored by his administration early on, the crack cocaine epidemic and the corresponding war on drugs that devastated urban communities, and the Iran-Contra scandal, in which arms were secretly sold to Iran to fund Nicaraguan rebels, casting a shadow over his administration's transparency. Still, Reagan left office in 1989 with high approval ratings and a transformed political landscape. The conservative movement had solidified its hold. His communication style, dubbed the Great Communicator, redefined presidential charisma. His belief in limited government, strong defense, and faith in the American people set the ideological tone for decades to come. But Reagan's revolution was not simply about policies, it was about myth-making. He rekindled an image of America as a shining city on a hill, a place of boundless opportunity and moral clarity. Whether one saw that city as real or illusionary, his narrative stuck. In the rearview mirror of history, Reagan remains a towering, if divisive, figure. He reminded Americans of who they thought they were and what they still wanted to believe they could be. It was, indeed, morning in America again, for better or worse, for hope or hubris. Part 24, The End of an Empire, the Cold War's Final Curtain. By the late 1980s, the world was beginning to stir with a strange and cautious optimism. Something enormous was shifting, slowly at first, then with breathtaking speed. The Cold War, which had for decades shaped every major decision of American foreign policy, was nearing its twilight. But no one, not even the most seasoned diplomats or intelligence chiefs, could have predicted how quietly the Iron Curtain would fall. It was not a missile or a military triumph that brought the Cold War to an end. It was a confluence of pressure, exhaustion, and an unlikely set of political gambles. In the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev was implementing bold reforms under the banners of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, hoping to revive a stagnant and crumbling system. But instead of tightening control, his efforts cracked open the foundations of the Soviet regime. Dissidents found their voices, satellite states saw a glimmer of hope, and the long-repressed fractures within the empire widened. In Eastern Europe, the people were watching and moving. In 1989, the winds of freedom swept across the continent. One by one, nations broke from Moscow's grip. Poland held semi-free elections. Hungary opened its borders. East Germans flooded into the West. And then, almost overnight, something that had once seemed utterly permanent collapsed into memory: the Berlin Wall fell. For Americans, it was a moment of surreal vindication. President George H.W. Bush, who had succeeded Reagan, responded not with jubilant gloating, but with measured restraint. He understood the fragility of the moment. Gorbachev remained in power, the Soviet Union still officially intact, and a misstep could provoke a backlash. Instead of claiming victory with fanfare, the U.S. quietly supported the transitions unfolding across Europe, cautious not to destabilize a collapsing superpower. But the end came anyway. In 1991, after a failed coup by hardliners, Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet Union dissolved. 15 republics became independent nations. The red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. A Cold War that had lasted more than 4 decades had ended, not with bombs, but with ballots and barricades torn down by hand. For many Americans, it felt like the dawning of a new age. The United States stood as the sole superpower. Its values, capitalism, democracy, free expression, seemed to have triumphed over the rigid authoritarianism of the East. The victory was intoxicating. Some declared the end of history, imagining a world where liberal democracy would spread without resistance. But the aftermath was more complicated. The sudden collapse of the Soviet Union created a vacuum, not just of power, but of purpose. What would America be without an enemy to define itself against? The Cold War had structured foreign policy, justified massive defense budgets, and created a narrative of moral clarity. Now, that structure was gone. Domestically, Americans expected a peace dividend, the idea that reduced military spending would allow for greater investment at home. But the 1990s brought new anxieties: the rise of globalization, the threat of rogue states, and the growing unease of a unipolar world. Old tensions did not disappear, they simply mutated. Yet, for a brief moment, it seemed possible that the world might realign itself into a more cooperative and peaceful order. Former Warsaw Pact countries turned westward, joining NATO and the European Union. Russia itself flirted with democracy and markets, though unevenly and with growing internal dissent. The end of the Cold War did not just redraw maps, it reshaped imaginations. It marked the end of the 20th century's dominant ideological struggle and ushered in a strange interlude of American supremacy, unchallenged but uncertain. The US had won, but the question lingered, won what, exactly? As Americans watched the last embers of the Cold War fade into ash, they looked ahead to a future that seemed, for the first time in decades, open-ended. The threat of global annihilation had receded. The dream of a peaceful world, long deferred, felt momentarily within reach. But beneath the optimism, the seeds of future conflict were already germinating in the shadows of victory. The Cold War was over, but history was not. Part 25, The Tech Boom, Silicon Dreams and Digital Frontiers. As the dust of the Cold War settled and the 1990s stretched forward, a different kind of revolution took root in America, one not fought with soldiers or policy, but with circuitry, code, and caffeine-fueled ambition. In fluorescent-lit garages, bland office parks, and emerging campuses with names like Palo Alto and Mountain View, a generation of dreamers, dropouts, and digital architects were building something the world had never seen, the Internet age. At first, it was slow. Modems crackled and hissed like arcane instruments as they connected users to a wild, sprawling web of static pages and blinking hyperlinks. But to those early pioneers, it was magic, an entire universe of possibility hiding inside a computer screen. By the mid-90s, what had once been a curiosity for hobbyists and academics began to seep into daily American life. Emails replaced letters. News went digital. Commerce left the mall and entered the homepage. Silicon Valley, once a sleepy region of orchards and aerospace subcontractors, became the beating heart of this transformation. It was no longer factories or oil that powered America's economy, it was ideas. Code became capital. Algorithms replaced assembly lines. Young, hoodie-clad engineers began earning more influence than titans of steel or coal ever dreamed of. Companies with strange names, Yahoo, Netscape, Amazon, Google, sprang up, not just to offer products, but to reshape how people lived, worked, and thought. Venture capital flowed like water. Stock prices soared on nothing more than the promise of disruption. The term dot-com millionaire entered the lexicon, along with a new breed of corporate culture where hierarchy took a back seat to innovation, and where casual dress belied world-changing ambition. America was no longer just a military superpower or cultural hegemon, it was becoming the architect of the digital future. The Internet was not merely a tool, it was a philosophy, a promise of decentralized freedom, of unfiltered information, of borderless connection. For many, it felt like another kind of manifest destiny, one carried not on wagons or warships, but on fiber-optic cables and server farms. And yet, even as the promise of a wired utopia captured the national imagination, cracks were forming beneath the surface. The digital divide widened, those with access thrived, while others were left behind. The deregulated frenzy of the market led to speculative bubbles, and by the year 2000, the dot-com crash reminded everyone that not all dreams were built to scale. Still, the transformation endured. Email became essential. E-commerce took root. Social networks, still a glimmer in the eyes of future developers, loomed just beyond the horizon. The infrastructure of a new age had been laid, and America was at its center. But perhaps more significantly, the tech boom redefined what power looked like. Where once might have been measured in tanks or GDP, it was now being calculated in data, bandwidth, and intellectual property. Silicon Valley's influence extended into politics, education, medicine, even defense. The United States wasn't just exporting products anymore, it was exporting platforms, protocols, and paradigms. Its culture was encoded into the operating systems of the world. In the quiet hum of data centers and the bright glow of laptop screens, a new frontier had opened. It lacked the visceral drama of war or revolution, but it was no less world-changing. For the first time in human history, a single nation had built not just a new economy or ideology, but an entirely new realm of existence. And as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Americans stood at the dawn of the digital era with awe, anxiety, and ambition. The tools they had created promised empowerment and connection, but also surveillance, manipulation, and control. The genie was out of the bottle. The network was live. The question no longer was whether America would lead, but whether it could guide the world it had unleashed. Part 26, 9/11 and the War Without End, Fear, Fire, and the Shape of a New Century. The morning of September 11, 2001, dawned like any other in the United States, clear blue skies, the hum of traffic, the rhythm of ordinary life unfolding. And then, in the span of a few horrifying minutes, everything changed. As two commercial airliners sliced into the twin towers of the World Trade Center, a third slammed into the Pentagon, and a fourth crashed into a Pennsylvania field, the illusion of American invulnerability shattered. The smoke, the screams, the staggering silence that followed, these were not just the sounds of destruction, but of a nation losing its sense of certainty. In the days that followed, the world watched the United States stagger to its feet in grief and rage. The smoldering ruins in Lower Manhattan became sacred ground, and Never Forget transformed from a promise into a rallying cry. Fear mingled with fury. There was a longing, not just for justice, but for vengeance. And with that, America embarked on a new kind of war. One with no clear borders, no conventional enemy, and no end in sight. President George W. Bush stood on the rubble with a bullhorn, vowing that those responsible would hear from all of America soon. The nation rallied, unified for a moment in a way it hadn't been for decades. The War on Terror began, not with a declaration, but with an invocation, of safety, of freedom, of retribution. First came Afghanistan, where the Taliban had harbored al-Qaeda. U.S. forces stormed in, toppling a regime with stunning speed, but quickly finding that nation-building in a land of tribes and mountains would be far harder than invasion. Then came Iraq. Citing weapons of mass destruction that were never found, the United States launched a preemptive war in 2003. Baghdad fell swiftly, but the peace was a mirage. The years that followed were drenched in blood, of soldiers, civilians, insurgents, and innocents. The conflict metastasized. Terrorism didn't vanish, it spread. Abu Ghraib, Fallujah, IEDs, and the haunting image of a hooded prisoner in black, these became the symbols of a war that eroded the moral certainty it had once claimed. Back home, America changed. Airports turned into security checkpoints. Surveillance expanded. Fear became a feature of daily life. Patriotism surged, but so did paranoia. Words like Islam, terror, and security became deeply entangled in the national psyche, often dangerously so. Civil liberties were debated, restricted, and, in some cases, quietly surrendered in the name of protection. And yet, the deeper America waded into the deserts and valleys of the Middle East, the less clear its mission became. What had begun as a manhunt for Osama bin Laden turned into sprawling occupations, counterinsurgency strategies, and endless debates about exit plans. Administrations changed. Strategy shifted. And still, soldiers deployed. Still, drones hovered. Still, the coffins returned home draped in flags. For a generation of Americans, 9/11 was a before and after line in the sand. It reshaped foreign policy, redefined national identity, and reframed how the world saw the United States. The wars that followed drained trillions of dollars, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and left behind a legacy as tangled as the ruins of a bombed-out city. There were moments of triumph. Bin Laden's death in 2011 brought a strange, fleeting catharsis, but no sense of closure. No clear victory. And so, the War on Terror morphed into something else, a background hum, a permanent fixture of geopolitical life. America had stepped into a new century not with celebration, but with fire and ash, burdened by the weight of its own might and the complexity of a world it could no longer control with force alone. It was no longer just a question of military strength. It was a question of identity, of how a nation built on ideals of liberty and hope could reconcile its actions with its values in a world transformed by fear. The scars of 9/11 remained, on the skyline, in the laws, in the hearts of those who lost someone that day or in the years that followed. The towers had fallen. But what stood in their place was something still unsteady, still forming, a new America, tempered by tragedy, armed to the teeth, and searching once more for the story it would tell itself about who it was, and who it wanted to be. Part 27, The Great Recession, Collapse and Reckoning in a Shattered Economy. The American dream, so long built on the promise of upward mobility and boundless opportunity, began to crack in the fluorescent-lit corridors of banks and the polished boardrooms of Wall Street. In 2008, the crash came not with gunfire or invasion, but with silence, screens blinking red, portfolios vanishing into nothing, homes slipping like sand from beneath the feet of ordinary families. It wasn't a foreign power or natural disaster that brought America to its knees this time. It was its own creation, a vast, intricate financial system so bloated with risk and speculation that a single collapse could send shockwaves around the world. It began with subprime mortgages, risky home loans handed out like candy during a decade of unchecked optimism. For years, housing prices had soared. People were told they could buy homes without income, without equity, without worry. Banks packaged these loans into financial products with names as abstract as they were dangerous, and sold them like magic beans promising endless growth. But beneath the glittering surface was rot. When homeowners began to default, the entire house of cards came tumbling down. Lehman Brothers fell. AIG nearly did. Stock markets plunged. Jobs evaporated. Americans watched their savings vanish, their retirements dissolve, and their confidence in the system implode. Families that had done everything right, gone to school, bought homes, paid taxes, were suddenly out of work, out of luck, and often out on the street. Lines at food banks grew longer. Homeless shelters filled. Tent cities sprang up in places that once symbolized affluence. And through it all, a bitter question began to echo: how could this happen? The answer lay in decades of deregulation, of belief in the infallibility of markets, of cozy relationships between government and finance that blurred the lines of accountability. While Wall Street received bailouts, hundreds of billions to stop the bleeding, Main Street bled out. Resentment simmered. The notion that the system was rigged began to take hold, not just on the fringes, but in the center of American life. President Barack Obama, who had taken office in the shadow of the collapse, faced an economic storm unlike anything since the Great Depression. His administration passed stimulus packages, bailed out automakers, and implemented new regulations like the Dodd-Frank Act. But recovery was uneven. Wall Street rebounded. The stock market soared. But for many working-class Americans, the years that followed felt like standing still, or worse, falling behind. And something deeper had shifted. Trust, already fragile after Watergate, Vietnam, and 9/11, was fraying further. The recession didn't just damage bank accounts, it undermined faith in the promise of America itself. That if you worked hard, played by the rules, and kept your head down, the system would reward you. Now, it seemed, the rules were for someone else. The game had changed. Inequality, once whispered about in academic circles, exploded into the mainstream. The Occupy Wall Street movement, with its chant of "We are the 99%, voiced a collective rage that transcended party lines. Americans began to look at billionaires not as aspirational figures, but as symptoms of a sick system. Debates erupted over the role of government, the purpose of capitalism, and the very nature of fairness. Yet even amid the despair, innovation surged. In garages and co-working spaces across the country, new tech firms were born. Social media giants grew from dorm rooms into empires. But these too brought new questions, about privacy, power, and the influence of platforms that now shaped not just markets, but minds. The Great Recession was not just an economic event. It was a reckoning. A mirror held up to the nation's face, showing cracks that had long been ignored. It marked a turning point, toward polarization, toward populism, and toward a new kind of politics shaped as much by grievance as by hope. In the end, America survived the crash. But it emerged changed, more divided, more cautious, and perhaps more aware that the foundations of greatness are not just built on wealth or growth, but on the trust and dignity of those who build the nation, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. The economy had faltered. But what shook the hardest was belief, the quiet, powerful belief that tomorrow could still be better than today. Part 28, Hope and Change, the Obama Years in a Nation Redefined. When Barack Obama stood before the nation on a cold January morning in 2009, his breath visible in the winter air, history unfolded in more than ceremony. He wasn't just becoming the 44th President of the United States, he was becoming its first black president, a symbol that the arc of American history, however jagged, could still bend towards something brighter. Millions crowded the National Mall, not simply to witness a transition of power, but to feel part of a rebirth, to believe, if only for a moment, that unity was still possible, that hope could still beat cynicism. Obama entered office amid the rubble of the Great Recession, with the economy hemorrhaging jobs and confidence at its lowest ebb in decades. But where the moment called for stability and repair, it also demanded vision. Yes, We Can was not just a campaign slogan, it was a declaration that America could find itself again, not by returning to the past, but by redefining what progress meant in the new century. His early years were marked by urgent action. A massive stimulus package was passed to stop the economic bleeding. The auto industry was rescued from collapse. A sweeping overhaul of the financial system, known as Dodd-Frank, sought to rein in Wall Street's excesses. But the centerpiece of his first term would be the long-elusive goal of healthcare reform. After bitter partisan warfare and months of bruising debate, the Affordable Care Act became law, a landmark that promised insurance to millions and redefined the relationship between Americans and their government. Yet for all the policy shifts, it was Obama's very presence in the White House that became both a beacon and a battleground. To many, he was the embodiment of American possibility, proof that the dream still lived. To others, he represented something unsettling, an erosion of the familiar, a challenge to old power structures, a symbol of change they had not asked for. Beneath the surface of unity, deeper rifts widened. Racism, long America's hidden wound, flared again in full view. The killing of Trayvon Martin, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the growing outrage over police violence brought centuries of injustice roaring back into the national consciousness. Obama, bound by both office and identity, walked a delicate line, never far enough for some, too far for others. His words sought calm, but the country he led was restive. Internationally, his presidency reoriented America's posture. He ended the war in Iraq, shifted focus to Afghanistan, and ordered the operation that led to the death of Osama bin Laden. He pursued diplomacy over saber-rattling, forging a nuclear agreement with Iran and reopening relations with Cuba. He stood in Cairo and called for a new relationship with the Muslim world. But his restraint often drew criticism, some saw in it wisdom, others weakness. Meanwhile, the political arena was growing more toxic. The rise of the Tea Party, a conservative populist movement fueled by economic frustration and cultural anxiety, reshaped Congress and hardened partisan lines. Gridlock became the norm. Compromise, once the engine of American governance, became a sign of betrayal. The promise of post-partisanship gave way to the reality of political trench warfare. And through it all, technology transformed everything. Social media became a new battlefield for hearts and minds. Misinformation, tribalism, and algorithm-driven outrage reshaped how Americans saw one another and themselves. The world was becoming flatter, faster, more connected, and paradoxically, more divided. As his presidency drew to a close, Obama left office with high approval ratings but a nation more fractured than when he began. His tenure was both historic and haunted, by expectations too great for any one person to fulfill, and by a backlash that would soon take dramatic shape. Still, for millions, he represented a singular moment, when the impossible became real, when the story of America added a chapter it had long resisted. His years in office were not a culmination, but a crossroads. He reminded a weary nation that history, while never linear, could still surprise, and that even amid struggle, progress was not only possible but worth believing in. Hope had not solved everything. change had not come as swiftly as some had wished. But both had been made visible, tangible, embodied in a man who once dared to dream of a different America, and then, through sweat and grace, stepped into the Oval Office to try and build it. Part 29, The Whiplash, From Obama to Trump, A Nation Divided. When the morning of November 9, 2016, dawned, America awoke to a political earthquake. Donald J. Trump, real estate mogul, reality television star, and political outsider, had won the presidency. The election had not just defied polls and predictions, it had upended the very assumptions that had guided American political life for decades. It was a reversal not only of party, but of tone, temperament, and ideology, a whiplash transition from the calm, cerebral presidency of Barack Obama to the firebrand populism of a man who had built his campaign on disruption. The victory exposed a fault line running deep through the American electorate. In the rusting towns of the Midwest, in the forgotten corners of the South, in rural enclaves and fading manufacturing hubs, millions had voted not out of allegiance to party, but out of desperation and defiance. They felt unseen, unheard, abandoned by globalization, and betrayed by a political class they viewed as aloof and ineffective. Trump's blunt promises to make America great again rang not as nostalgia, but as a battle cry, a vow to undo the perceived damage of elites and reclaim a country many felt slipping away. In Washington, the Trump administration began not with a conventional transition, but with turbulence. Policies were announced via Twitter. Alliances long considered sacrosanct were questioned. Trade wars were launched. Immigration crackdowns, executive orders, and polarizing rhetoric became daily occurrences. Where past presidents had worked to unify, Trump often seemed to relish division, his presidency operating more like a campaign in perpetual motion, drawing sharp lines and daring the opposition to cross them. To his supporters, Trump was a warrior against the status quo, a breaker of norms they believed had become corrupt. To his critics, he was a threat to democratic institutions, a man untethered to truth or decorum, whose leadership eroded trust in everything from the press to the judiciary. The battle lines were not just political, they were cultural, existential, even personal. Every tweet, every rally, every press conference was another flare in a widening conflict over what kind of nation America truly was. Internationally, Trump's presidency marked a shift from multilateralism to nationalism. Long-standing trade agreements were torn up and renegotiated. NATO allies were chastised. The United States pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, and other pacts that had defined its post-war leadership. America was no longer the steady hand at the table, it was a wild card, unpredictable and unapologetically self-interested. Yet, amid the chaos, the economy boomed. Unemployment reached historic lows. Markets surged. Supporters pointed to these gains as proof that Trump's unconventional approach worked. But beneath the surface, old divisions deepened. Race, class, gender, and geography split the country into warring tribes, each with its own media, its own facts, its own fears. The presidency was not only controversial, it was impeached. Twice. First, for pressuring a foreign government to investigate a political rival. Second, for inciting a violent insurrection against the certification of an election he refused to concede. The storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021, was a moment that stunned the world and scarred the American psyche. A sitting president had fueled an assault on democracy itself, not through stealth or subversion, but in plain sight, with cameras rolling and flags waving. Yet even that was not enough to fully break his grip on a large swath of the American electorate. For tens of millions, he remained a champion, a voice against a system they no longer believed in. For tens of millions more, he was a danger that had to be confronted, a symptom of a deeper illness in the body politic. Trump's years in office did not create America's divisions, but they exposed and amplified them with relentless clarity. They revealed a nation that was no longer having a conversation with itself, but a shouting match, where compromise was weakness and opposition was betrayal. In the vacuum of shared truth and civility, something fundamental frayed. The transition of power, once a ritual of resilience, became a rupture. America had not simply swung from left to right. It had lurched into a new era, one where the very idea of a shared national identity seemed elusive, and where the future felt more uncertain than ever. Part 30, Pandemic and Protest, America in the Crucible. When the first whispers of a strange virus came out of China in late 2019, few Americans imagined the storm it would become. By March 2020, COVID-19 was no longer a distant concern, it was a national emergency. Cities fell silent, streets emptied, and the hum of American life was replaced by the eerie quiet of lockdowns. Schools closed. Offices went dark. Hospitals brimmed with the sick and dying. Ventilators, masks, and hand sanitizer became symbols of survival. In an instant, the most powerful nation on Earth was brought to its knees by something it could not see, could not bomb, could not spin. The pandemic became more than a public health crisis, it was a stress test for the American system. And the fractures showed. The virus exposed the vast inequities that had long existed beneath the surface. Essential workers, often low-paid and disproportionately people of color, bore the brunt of the exposure. Minority communities died at higher rates. Rural hospitals faltered. Urban ERs overflowed. And even as scientists pleaded for unity, the crisis became political. Masks became a statement. Vaccines a battleground. Public health a war of words. The truth, so desperately needed, became another casualty in an era already weary with disinformation. Leadership stumbled. Mixed messages from the White House sowed confusion. Governors were left to fight over supplies. Press conferences became theater. What should have been a moment of national solidarity became yet another chapter in America's deepening division. Yet even in the darkness, there was resilience. Doctors and nurses worked past exhaustion. Teachers adapted overnight. Scientists raced for a vaccine. Families mourned apart. And a nation learned to zoom, to wait, to hope. But if the virus brought America's vulnerabilities to light, another crisis would soon ignite its fury. On May 25, 2020, in the city of Minneapolis, a black man named George Floyd died beneath the knee of a police officer. The video, slow, brutal, undeniable, shook the conscience of a nation already fraying at the edges. The cry of "I can't breathe" echoed through every city, every screen, every heart that had grown tired of injustice. What followed was a summer unlike any other. Protests erupted in all 50 states. Not just in big cities, but in small towns. Not just among the young, but across generations. Millions marched, held signs, chanted names: Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Elijah McClain. The movement wasn't just about George Floyd. It was about centuries of pain. About the enduring scars of slavery, segregation, and systemic neglect. About a promise unkept. Statues toppled. Murals rose. The streets became classrooms. Words like systemic racism and white privilege entered the mainstream lexicon. Corporations issued statements. Politicians bent knees. But amid the hope of change came more confusion, more division. Riots broke out. Police clashed with protesters. The calls for justice were met with both solidarity and scorn. In the heart of this crucible, America was forced to look at itself, not as a beacon, but as a work in progress, unfinished and raw. The pandemic and the protests were twin fires. One exposed the fragility of America's institutions. The other revealed the depth of its unresolved wounds. And through it all, a presidential election loomed. One where mail-in ballots replaced crowded voting lines. Where misinformation swirled like smoke. Where truth itself seemed contested. And yet, through chaos, America chose. In November 2020, Joseph R. Biden Jr. was elected president. The transfer of power, though marred by the Capitol insurrection, ultimately held. Democracy, bruised and gasping, survived. But something had shifted. The pandemic had revealed how interconnected, and how divided, Americans truly were. The protests had laid bare the gulf between the dream and the reality of justice. And the nation, once so certain of its place in the world, now faced hard questions about its soul, its future, and its ability to heal. In the quiet that followed, America stood not as a conqueror, not as a victim, but as a country in recovery, still grappling with what it meant to be one nation, under God, still learning how to breathe again. Part 31, Divided We Scroll, the Digital Age and Its Discontents. As America emerged from the twin crucibles of pandemic and protest, it stepped not into calm waters but into the wild churn of an accelerating digital age. By the 2020s, life online was no longer an accessory to reality, it was reality. Screens framed every moment. Algorithms shaped every thought. From the halls of power to the living rooms of the forgotten, the digital tide swept across American life, leaving connection, confusion, and confrontation in its wake. Social media platforms, once celebrated as tools of empowerment and global community, had become battlefields. Every post a position. Every like a statement. Echo chambers thickened, pulling people deeper into curated worlds where opposing ideas weren't just disagreed with, they were enemies. News, once the cornerstone of democratic discourse, fractured into 1,000 splinters, each claiming truth. From viral memes to deepfakes, reality became fluid, selectable, customizable, disposable. For many, this new age brought voice. Marginalized communities used digital spaces to organize, protest, educate. Movements like #MeToo, Black Lives Matter, and climate activism found global resonance through hashtags. An entire generation spoke in stories and threads, demanding to be heard in a language older powers barely understood. But for all the noise, the signal often grew faint. Outrage traveled faster than understanding. Conspiracies spread like wildfire while corrections smoldered in silence. America's politics, too, bent under the weight of the shift. Elections became information wars. Candidates were measured not by their platforms but by their virality. Policy gave way to performance. Debate became theater. And truth, objective, shared, grounding, slipped ever further from reach. To question was patriotic, to believe, naive, to trust, almost dangerous. The digital terrain rewarded spectacle, punished nuance, and left millions unsure of what to believe, let alone how to find their way back to common ground. Meanwhile, the lines between public and private vanished. Every action could be captured, judged, archived. Cancel culture and call-outs redefined accountability, sometimes with justice, sometimes with indiscriminate fury. Employers scanned tweets. Strangers dug through old posts. A misstep online could end a career, a life, a legacy. For younger Americans raised in this environment, identity became a performance both empowering and exhausting. They curated their image for followers while battling anxiety behind the scenes. Likes became currency. Validation, a drug. Yet even as the digital world frayed social bonds, it also held America together through crisis. During lockdowns, it connected the isolated. It allowed education to continue, commerce to adapt, families to see each other through glowing rectangles. It gave artists a canvas, businesses a lifeline, and movements a megaphone. But with every click came a cost. Mental health crises surged. Teen suicide rates rose. Loneliness became epidemic. The tools that promised connection often delivered its shadow. And looming above all was the question of control. Who shaped the algorithms? Who moderated the speech? Who benefited from the chaos? Tech titans, once college students in garages, now sat atop empires larger than many nations. Facebook, Twitter, Google, TikTok, modern coliseums where the daily battles for hearts and minds played out. Congressional hearings were held, regulations threatened, but the machine rumbled on, too vast, too entrenched, too profitable to pause. As the 2020s unfolded, it became clear that America was living not just through a political or economic shift, but a civilizational one. The very structure of thought, discourse, and democracy was being rewired in real time. And unlike past revolutions, this one came with no blueprint, no clear heroes or villains. Just an endless scroll of updates, outrage, and uncertainty. In this new world, America's greatest challenge was not just to protect its institutions or values, it was to remember what those values meant in a landscape where memory itself could be edited. where history was filtered, where identity fractured under the glare of 1,000 lenses. And yet, even in the midst of this chaos, the promise endured, that beneath the noise, there still existed a yearning for truth, for meaning, for something real. That in the haze of pixels and opinions, a people might still find their way back to each other. The American experiment had survived revolutions, depressions, wars, and reckonings. Now it faced its most intangible trial, a war not of armies or ideologies, but of attention, trust, and the soul of the shared reality itself. Part 32, Pandemic Nation, Resilience, Revelation, and Reckoning. When the first whispers of a new virus reached American shores, it felt distant, another outbreak in some far-off market, like so many before it. But within weeks, the hum of everyday life in the United States was silenced by something invisible. COVID-19 did not arrive with bombs or banners. It arrived with a breath. And with it came one of the most defining trials of the American century. The pandemic was not merely a public health emergency. It was a mirror held to the face of a nation. Every fracture, every fault line, every forgotten corner of American life was laid bare. Hospitals were overwhelmed, not only by the virus but by decades of underinvestment and inequity. Essential workers, long invisible in political rhetoric, became the nation's frontline defense, though many lacked protections themselves. Grocery clerks, nurses, delivery drivers, sanitation crews, heroes paid in applause, often not much more. The economy shuttered overnight. Streets emptied. The rhythms of American life, school runs, subway commutes, birthday parties, weekend games, faded into the stillness of lockdown. For millions, work meant a kitchen table and a flickering screen. For others, it meant nothing at all, jobs gone, businesses closed, savings drained. The lines at food banks stretched miles. Eviction notices piled at doorsteps. For the first time in generations, many Americans feared not just for their health, but for their place in a system that suddenly felt perilously fragile. And in that fear, another contagion spread, mistrust. What began as a fight against a virus became a battlefield of narratives. Masks became symbols. Vaccines, political declarations. Science, once a foundation of consensus, was pulled into the storm of partisan warfare. Public health officials faced threats. Conspiracy theories flourished. In a land of individualism, collective action proved elusive. America struggled to speak with one voice, even against a common enemy. Yet there were glimmers, too. Neighborhoods organized care networks. Strangers delivered groceries to the elderly. Artists performed from balconies. Teachers reinvented classrooms through pixels. Families, scattered across time zones, found comfort in nightly video calls. In the pause, some rediscovered connection. Others, solitude. And all of them, knowingly or not, were part of a moment that would etch itself into history. As months turned to years, the pandemic's legacy deepened. Children grew up in masks. Seniors died alone. Weddings were postponed, funerals streamed through phones. Rituals unraveled. And yet, slowly, life returned. But it did not return the same. Remote work reshaped cities. The labor market redefined itself. A new awareness of mental health swept through public consciousness. And a reckoning with racial injustice, sparked by the murder of George Floyd during the pandemic's peak, ignited one of the largest protest movements in American history. The virus had isolated Americans in their homes, but in doing so, it united them in outrage and urgency. The federal response, fragmented at times and fervent at others, became its own case study in democracy under stress. States clashed with the federal government. Governors became wartime leaders. Misinformation battled data. And as vaccines emerged, so too did new divides, between those ready to move forward and those still gripped by fear, or distrust, or loss. Through it all, the question loomed, what kind of country would emerge on the other side? America, shaped by resilience, did not collapse. But it was changed. The pandemic accelerated trends that had simmered for decades: technological dependence, political polarization, inequality, and global interconnectedness. It forced a reckoning with what it meant to protect one another, to believe in common good, to be part of a national story still being written. And in the end, it left scars, some visible, some not. Empty chairs at dinner tables. Quiet grief. Lingering exhaustion. But it also left seeds. Of reform. Of remembrance. Of a kind of wisdom that only suffering can teach. In the story of American power and purpose, the pandemic will not be remembered as a triumph of might, but as a test of will. A moment when the most powerful nation on earth was brought to its knees not by war, but by biology. And a moment when it had to decide, not just how to recover, but how to grow. For pandemics end. But the questions they raise echo long after the final case is counted. And America, always in motion, now had to carry those echoes forward, into a world forever changed. Part 33, Culture Wars and the American Identity Crisis. In the aftermath of the pandemic's long shadow, as life resumed its churn and new crises emerged to fill the headlines, a quieter storm raged across the American consciousness, a battle not of armies or economies, but of meaning. The culture wars, once dismissed as background noise in the cacophony of politics, became a central force tearing at the threads of national identity. At stake was not just policy, but perception, of what it meant to be American in a century defined by change. This wasn't the first time Americans had disagreed over values, over who belonged and whose story got told. But in the 21st century, the battleground had shifted. Social media turned every debate into a firestorm, every opinion into a referendum. What began as questions, about race, gender, history, and fairness, soon calcified into hardened fronts. Statues were toppled, school boards fought over textbooks, and corporations weighed in on everything from voting rights to pronouns. No sphere of life was untouched. Movies. Sports. Classrooms. Boardrooms. Churches. Even family dinner tables became arenas for ideological skirmishes. For some, the conflict felt like a necessary reckoning, a long overdue confrontation with injustice and exclusion. For others, it felt like erasure, as if the past was being rewritten and traditional beliefs were under siege. The American story, once taught as a unifying narrative of progress and freedom, was now under scrutiny. Whose freedom? At what cost? To speak of patriotism or protest was no longer neutral, it was a statement, a side. The intensity of these cultural clashes reflected deeper fears. The country was changing, demographically, spiritually, technologically. White Americans, long the majority, faced the reality of becoming one voice among many in a more diverse, pluralistic society. Christian dominance waned as secularism and other faiths gained ground. Rural communities watched urban hubs shape the cultural future, often feeling left behind or ridiculed. Meanwhile, younger generations redefined identity itself, not as something inherited, but constructed and fluid. The clash between generations became especially sharp. Boomers, raised on Cold War certainties and a linear sense of progress, often struggled to understand the language and priorities of millennials and Gen Z. In return, younger Americans questioned the foundations of a system they saw as broken, one that handed them student debt, climate anxiety, and political gridlock. Words like equity, privilege, and representation became both rallying cries and flashpoints. Symbols became sacred or suspect. Even the American flag could be read as a badge of pride or a mark of protest, depending on who waved it. Politicians, sensing the emotional weight of these battles, stoked the fires. Culture became policy. Governors banned books or mandated them. Laws were passed regulating what could be said in classrooms, what bathrooms could be used, what histories could be acknowledged. Courtrooms filled with cases about cake, speech, and civil rights. And through it all, the question persisted, could a nation as vast and varied as the United States sustain a common identity at all? Yet beneath the shouting, another current flowed, quieter, but insistent. Americans still shared much more than they often admitted. Love of freedom, yes, but also of storytelling, of reinvention, of the belief that things could get better. In small towns and big cities alike, people found ways to live together, to disagree without division. Barbershops, libraries, street corners, kitchens, these became the places where bridges formed, even as the headlines screamed of conflict. The culture wars were real, and they caused real harm: bullying, censorship, distrust, fear. But they also revealed a truth at the heart of America's restlessness: this was a nation forever rewriting its script. From the Puritans to the suffragettes, from abolitionists to immigrants, the United States had always been defined not by unanimity, but by argument. The current crisis was simply the latest chapter in that tradition. And if there was to be a way forward, it would not come from silencing dissent or forcing agreement. It would come from remembering that identity is not a zero-sum game, that multiple truths can coexist, that a flag is made of many threads, and that the American dream, for all its complications, is still a dream worth refining. So the question remained: could the United States embrace its complexity without collapsing under it? Could it tell a story broad enough to hold all its voices? The answer was still unwritten, but it was being composed every day, not just in courtrooms and cable news, but in the quiet choices of people trying to live, together, in a country still searching for its soul. Part 34, The Digital Mirror, Youth, Technology, and the Shaping of Tomorrow. By the time the 21st century hit its stride, the shape of American identity was increasingly being drawn not with ink or ideology, but in pixels and posts. And at the helm of this transformation were the young. Born into a world where the internet was not an invention but an environment, Gen Z, and the rising generation after them, held the power to define the nation's future not by revolution or legislation alone, but by the rhythm of their scrolls and the weight of their clicks. Unlike any generation before them, these young Americans were global natives from birth. Their classrooms stretched across screens. Their friendships crossed oceans. Their sense of community was as likely to be formed in a subreddit or group chat as on a neighborhood block. What it meant to be American was no longer tied solely to geography or tradition. It was something hybrid, fluid, constantly remixing. Technology did not merely connect them, it shaped them. Algorithms whispered what to care about, who to follow, what to fear. TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube became their storytellers, educators, and trendsetters. Even politics, once the solemn domain of suited figures in smoky rooms, became memeable, streamable, hashtagged. Protest movements erupted not in town squares but through viral videos. Awareness was a swipe away. Outrage was instantaneous. This generation inherited a planet burning with both promise and peril. They were born into a post-9/11 world of surveillance and security checks, matured through a recession that made their parents cautious, and came of age under the shadow of a pandemic that reshaped how they saw health, trust, and time. They faced school shootings not as rare tragedies but as drills. Climate change wasn't theoretical, it was the backdrop to their childhood summers, their flooded neighborhoods, their smoky skies. With every crisis, they grew skeptical of institutions but bold in their demands. Hopeful but weary. But while the digital mirror reflected immense complexity, it also revealed a longing for meaning, for justice, for connection. Young Americans today were not apolitical, they were differently political. Traditional parties felt distant, but causes felt urgent. They marched for racial justice, for LGBTQ+ rights, for mental health awareness, for the right to exist in a world that saw them fully. Their activism was intersectional, informed, and often impatient. They didn't just want to fix the system, they wanted to rebuild it. Older generations often struggled to interpret this fervor. Was it idealism or entitlement? Courage or chaos? But beneath the generational friction lay a familiar rhythm. Every wave of American youth, from the revolutionaries of 1776 to the freedom riders of the 1960s, had unsettled the status quo. The difference now was speed. A movement could form in the morning and circle the globe by sundown. Change, or at least the call for it, came fast and loud. Of course, the digital age brought its shadows. Anxiety, depression, loneliness, all surged in an age of infinite connection. The very platforms that amplified youth voices also harvested their attention, blurred their self-image, and fueled tribalism. The pressure to be perfect, to perform, to have a take on every issue, it could be suffocating. Many young people toggled between hyper-awareness and quiet numbness, scrolling for meaning in a world that sometimes felt too big to hold. Yet for all this, they were still dreaming. Dreaming of cleaner air, of student debt forgiveness, of inclusive classrooms and safe streets, of a democracy that actually listened. Their music, art, and humor revealed a generation that could critique the world while still believing it could be better. They were the children of contradictions, more skeptical, yet more imaginative, more fragile, yet more fearless. And they would inherit it all, the triumphs, the failures, the fragile hopes of a divided republic. Whether they built something better or watched it fall would depend on choices still unfolding. But one thing was certain, America would not look the same by the time they were done. In the gleam of their devices, in the cadence of their voices, in the silence they sometimes chose instead of speaking, they were rewriting the script. Not tearing down the past for sport, but digging through it for something usable. Something worth carrying forward. The country, for all its age and scars, was still young in their hands. And perhaps, in the paradox of digital lives seeking real belonging, they would discover something powerful. That connection, not control, was the heartbeat of a better tomorrow. Part 35, Cracks in the Mirror, the Battle for Truth in a Fragmented Media Age. In the not-so-distant past, the American public gathered around a common hearth, the nightly news. A few trusted anchors spoke in measured tones, presenting a shared sequence of facts, images, and interpretations. Though never perfect and always shaped by the biases of their times, these voices formed a kind of narrative glue, a mutual lens through which a diverse and sprawling nation could see itself, argue with itself, and understand the world beyond its borders. But that mirror, once singular and steady, has shattered into a million gleaming fragments. In the age of smartphones, algorithm-fed feeds, and 24-hour information cycles, America no longer speaks in unison. It scrolls in isolation. The average citizen now lives inside a personalized echo chamber, a digital landscape sculpted not by editors or journalists, but by unseen mathematical formulas that reward outrage, affirmation, and spectacle. News, once curated with a sense of order, now arrives as a torn, raw, emotional, and often unverified. The lines between journalism and entertainment blur, and the space for quiet reflection is eroded by the noise of hot takes and viral clips. For every event, there is now not one narrative, but many. A protest is a peaceful plea for justice in one feed, a riot of destruction in another. A scientific discovery is hailed as progress in one corner, dismissed as conspiracy in the next. This fragmentation is not merely annoying, it is existential. Without a shared understanding of reality, how can a democracy debate, let alone decide? The media itself has become part of the battlefield. Trust in traditional news outlets has plummeted, often falling along partisan lines. Once venerated institutions find themselves branded as fake news or dismissed as out-of-touch elites. Meanwhile, alternative outlets, some earnest, others deeply manipulative, have risen to prominence. They speak in the language of certainty, of moral clarity, of us versus them. In a world where complexity feels exhausting, their simplicity is seductive. Social media has made everyone a broadcaster, but not everyone a journalist. The democratization of speech, a victory for free expression, has also made the truth harder to find. A single tweet, laced with anger or misinformation, can ignite global outrage. A video, stripped of context, can redefine public perception before facts emerge. In the rush to react, to opine, to go viral, accuracy often becomes a casualty. And in the digital fog, bad actors thrive, foreign trolls, conspiracy theorists, digital provocateurs, fanning flames and deepening divides. But this is not just a crisis of institutions or platforms. It is a crisis of attention. The average American, bombarded with more content in a day than their ancestors saw in a year, struggles to discern signal from noise. The very architecture of modern media preys on this vulnerability. Clickbait headlines, outrage-driven monetization, and algorithmic incentives all push toward extremes. Nuance drowns. Calm sinks. What survives is whatever shouts the loudest. And yet, in the midst of this chaotic information storm, new kinds of media literacy are taking root. Young people, often accused of apathy, are learning to decode the digital world with sophistication. Non-profit journalism organizations, long-form podcasts, and fact-checking sites rise to meet the need. A hunger grows, not just for content, but for clarity. For context. For truth that doesn't just affirm, but informs. Still, the path forward is anything but clear. Can a society function without a common understanding of what is real? Can citizenship survive when every conversation starts with "Where did you hear that?" instead of "What do we do next?" These are no longer academic questions. They are the quiet crisis beneath every debate, every election, every moment of national reckoning. The media may be a mirror, but it is also a forge. It reflects what we are, but it also shapes what we might become. If that mirror is cracked, it is up to the citizens, readers, viewers, scrollers, to decide what to piece together and what to discard. The battle for truth will not be won by algorithms or outrage. It will be won, slowly and uncertainly, by those who insist that truth still matters. That facts are worth the effort. That even in a fractured age, it is still possible to see one another clearly, and to speak, if not with one voice, at least from a shared world. Part 36, The Disintegration of Empathy in an Age of Overexposure. In the quiet recesses of an older world, empathy was often born from distance. A newspaper photograph of a starving child, a single column recounting the horror of a faraway war, these fragments pierced the heart precisely because they were rare, singular, and solemn. They asked for reflection. But today, suffering arrives by the second. It floods our screens, stacked and autoplayed, tragedy upon tragedy until it becomes less a summons to care and more a dull, ever-present background hum. And so, in this paradoxical age, one where the whole world's pain is visible and immediate, empathy begins to falter. We live in an era of relentless exposure. In every corner of the globe where a fire breaks out, a missile lands, or a child cries, someone is filming. Someone is uploading. There is no longer a buffer between the personal and the public, between intimacy and spectacle. And though the intention may be to inform or mobilize, the effect is often numbing. What once stirred us now scrolls past in an endless feed. What once demanded our focus now competes with cat videos, makeup tutorials, and political memes. The horror is still there, but our reaction is blunted by the volume. This is not a failure of heart, it is a failure of saturation. The human nervous system was never designed to carry the grief of the entire planet, all at once. Evolution gave us tribes, not timelines. It gave us the ability to weep over a neighbor's misfortune, not to parse a genocide halfway around the globe while making breakfast. The internet has collapsed the world, but it has stretched our compassion thin. We flinch, we share, we move on. Not because we don't care, but because we don't know what to do with so much caring. Overexposure also has a strange consequence, it makes everything seem equal. The death of a soldier, the humiliation of a celebrity, a natural disaster, a fake news story, all are presented in the same digital frame, the same font, the same format. The gravity of suffering is flattened by the style of its presentation. We may intellectually know the difference, but emotionally, the line blurs. A TikTok about war blends into a reel about coffee. And in this confusion of tone, empathy loses its footing. Moreover, we begin to develop what psychologists call compassion fatigue. It is not cruelty, it is exhaustion. The heart, bombarded too often, retreats. And in that retreat, apathy takes root. We start to view suffering not as something to engage with, but as something to survive. Another disaster? Another mass shooting? Another refugee crisis? We glance. We sigh. We scroll. And yet, all is not lost. For even in this age of overexposure, small acts of deep empathy break through. A child holding a handmade sign for peace. A stranger covering a wounded man with their coat. A nurse's exhausted eyes behind her mask. These are not trending hashtags. They are not headline stories. But they persist, like quiet lanterns in the dark. They remind us that empathy is not about scale, it's about presence. To witness one person fully, even for a moment, is to resist the tide of numbing. The challenge ahead is not to feel everything, that is impossible. The challenge is to feel something, deeply and well. To choose a story and stay with it. To remember that real empathy is not fleeting, it is inconvenient, it takes time, it asks us to change. And in a world so designed for speed and spectacle, that kind of empathy is nothing short of rebellion. The disintegration of empathy is not inevitable. It is reversible. But only if we stop treating the pain of others as passive content, and start treating it as a call, messy, human, and often unresolved. Because to be numb is to surrender. And to care, even when it hurts, is to stay fully, defiantly alive. Part 37, Hope in the Cracks, Microresistance and the Power of Small Acts. Beneath the looming machinery of nations, ideologies, and weapons stockpiled in silence, there is a softer current that hums unseen. It does not march with flags or thunder with slogans. It does not trend on platforms or echo in parliamentary halls. It resides in kitchens and classrooms, in quiet refusals and daily kindnesses, in the human spaces too small to be noticed by geopolitical analysts. This is the realm of microresistance, the defiant, enduring hope etched into the smallest of acts, a fragile thread that holds back the abyss one stitch at a time. In an age when headlines scream conflict and collapse, it is tempting to believe the world is careening toward a single, unstoppable fate. That individuals are powerless, that change comes only through legislation or revolution. But this belief overlooks the quiet revolutions that unfold each day. A teacher who rewrites a lesson to humanize a so-called enemy. A shopkeeper who greets a refugee as a neighbor. A programmer who refuses to write surveillance code. A child who chooses not to hate, despite the world telling them otherwise. These acts are not grand. They will not be immortalized in textbooks or turned into statues. Yet they shape culture in ways laws never can. They whisper across the divide that humanity persists, not in spite of the chaos, but because of it. When systems fail to protect, it is the small, often invisible gestures that become lifelines. A shared meal. A quiet apology. A stranger stepping in where leaders stay silent. Hope is not a monument. It is a mosaic, fragile, uneven, and built from fragments. It lives in those who dare to plant trees they'll never sit beneath, who create art in times of censorship, who love boldly in cultures that punish difference. These are the unquantifiable resistors to despair. They do not demand a better world with fists, they build it brick by invisible brick. And though their labor rarely makes the evening news, it is what holds the center while everything else threatens to fall apart. In conflict zones, there are doctors who patch wounds without asking allegiance. In authoritarian states, there are poets who smuggle truth beneath layers of metaphor. In fractured democracies, there are elders who remind the young of their power to vote, to speak, to listen. And in all of these, there is a singular refusal to surrender the idea that dignity belongs to everyone. Cynicism has become fashionable, even protective. It tells us not to hope, because hope is naive. But cynicism is the true luxury of the comfortable. It asks nothing of us. Hope, on the other hand, is demanding. It asks us to show up. It requires risk. It can break your heart. And still, it persists, because the alternative is silence. To resist at scale is daunting. To resist in miniature is human. And when these miniatures multiply, one teacher, one artist, one volunteer, they create something formidable. A counter-narrative. A resistance not of slogans, but of values. Not of outrage, but of care. And this resistance does not need to overthrow the world to change it. It needs only to hold space, until those with power remember what power is for. In every war, there are moments when strangers become lifelines. In every crisis, there are hands held across boundaries we once thought impassable. And in every age of despair, there is a generation that remembers how to hope, not because the world is kind, but because they choose to be kind despite it. This is the power of small acts. They don't stop the storm. But they remind us we are not alone in it. that there is something worth saving, and someone else trying to save it too. In the cracks of empire and ideology, of war and waiting, these acts grow like weeds in concrete. Resilient, tender, and utterly, stubbornly alive. Part 38, Deterrence or Destiny, is war truly inevitable? It is a question as old as civilization itself, posed in whispers by philosophers, screamed in the trenches by dying men, and silently pondered in the war rooms of every great power. Is war simply the destiny of mankind, or can it be deterred, truly, meaningfully, across generations? The 20th century's descent into mechanized slaughter seemed to suggest one answer. The nuclear stalemate of the Cold War hinted at another. And today, standing once more on the precipice of uncertainty, the world finds itself returning to the question with renewed urgency. Humanity has always danced a tense ballet between creation and destruction. The same ingenuity that raised cathedrals and coded computers also designed missiles and laid minefields. The contradiction lies at the core of our condition. We are capable of astonishing empathy, yet driven by primal fear. And history, it seems, is the slow, spiraling conversation between these two instincts. Peace is not the default, it is the exception, hard-won and easily lost. But does this mean that war is coded into our DNA, or simply into the flawed systems we've inherited and sustained? For much of modern history, deterrence has been the uneasy answer. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction didn't eliminate war, it merely made total war unthinkable. Nuclear weapons cast a long shadow, and in that darkness, a strange kind of order emerged, not trust, but terror shared equally. It worked, in a twisted way. The world did not erupt into fire. But the strategy depended on rational actors, on a finely calibrated game of brinkmanship. And in today's world, where state lines blur with cyber interference, where rogue actors and artificial intelligence muddy the rules, deterrence feels less like a solution and more like a brittle fiction. Still, we cling to it. We build arsenals not to use them, but to prevent others from doing so. We form alliances not purely out of friendship, but to raise the cost of aggression. We speak of peace, but we prepare for war. And the paradox is that this preparation may indeed keep us from plunging into chaos, until, of course, it doesn't. Because deterrence is a gamble. It assumes perfect information, perfect restraint, perfect timing. It relies on human judgment at its most fragile moments, moments of panic, confusion, and pride. A misread radar. A rogue submarine. A glitch in a system no one fully understands. These are not hypotheticals. They have nearly happened. And one day, one may not be caught in time. So the question must evolve. If deterrence alone cannot guarantee safety, what else can? Can education reshape the next generation's instincts? Can diplomacy outpace weaponry and innovation? Can empathy be scaled like industry once was? The optimist argues that humanity has changed before. Slavery, once normal, became unthinkable. Child labor was curtailed. Rights were expanded. The arc may be slow, but it can bend. And so too, they say, can our relationship with war. Perhaps not through treaties or stockpiles, but through something quieter, understanding. The stories we tell, the history we teach, the neighbors we learn not to fear. Change begins in the collective imagination before it reaches policy. The pessimist, however, will point to the cycles. To Rome and Carthage, to Sarajevo and Baghdad. To every ceasefire followed by another mobilization. War may pause, but it never seems to die. It slumbers in the soil of resentment, watered by inequality and mistrust, waiting for the right storm to rise again. And yet, even the pessimist must admit, we are still here. Battered, yes. But breathing. Capable, still, of a different choice. The fact that we even ask the question, can war be avoided, suggests a flicker of hope that the answer might be yes. Deterrence may keep the wolves at bay, but destiny is not a fixed road. It is a path made by the walking. And if war is a story we keep repeating, then perhaps the task of our time is not to silence the instinct, but to rewrite the ending. It will not be easy. Peace never is. But maybe, just maybe, it is not impossible. Part 39, Learning from the Brink, Near Misses in Modern History. History doesn't always announce its gravest moments with fanfare. Sometimes, it tiptoes quietly along the edge of catastrophe, revealing only in hindsight just how close the world came to unraveling. These near misses, unfired missiles, misread data, last-minute phone calls, have punctuated the modern age like invisible landmines, hidden in bureaucratic corridors and hidden command posts. And yet, they remain among the most valuable and least taught lessons of our time. Because it is in these moments, when annihilation seemed a breath away, that we see the fragility of peace not as theory, but as lived reality. Consider October 27, 1962, what historians now call Black Saturday. Amid the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet submarine, B-59, sat silently beneath the surface of the Atlantic, cut off from communication. Above them, U.S. destroyers dropped depth charges in a show of force, unaware that the sub's captain believed war had already begun. He ordered the launch of a nuclear torpedo. 2 officers agreed. A third, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. His dissent, quiet, desperate, resolute, may have saved the world from nuclear war. One man. One moment. That is how close we came. And it was not the last. In 1983, a Soviet early warning system erroneously detected a U.S. missile launch. The officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, was told to report it as an attack. Protocol demanded retaliation. But Petrov hesitated. Something felt wrong. He chose not to act. Again, a single decision stood between humanity and destruction, not because the system worked, but because a human being had the intuition to question it. These aren't just stories of individual heroism. They are reminders that our intricate machinery of deterrence, defense, and diplomacy is held together not by infallible systems, but by fallible people, people who are tired, pressured, sometimes scared. People who must make world-altering choices in moments measured in seconds. There was also the 1995 Norwegian rocket incident, where Russia nearly launched a retaliatory nuclear strike after mistaking a scientific research rocket for an incoming attack. It was a communications failure, a chain of misunderstandings. And yet, the consequences could have been irreversible. These were not acts of aggression, but accidents waiting to happen. That they didn't is luck. That they might again is certainty. What these moments reveal is a painful truth: we are not invincible. For all our technological advancement, for all our doctrines and simulations, peace remains a balancing act performed on a razor's edge. And too often, our institutions are reactive, not proactive. We plan for war more rigorously than we plan for peace. We invest in weapons but not in the education that might prevent their use. Yet, the near misses also offer something else: hope. They show that even in the face of immense pressure, individuals can choose restraint. They suggest that diplomacy, intuition, and doubt have a place in a world too often dominated by certainty and aggression. They whisper that history, while prone to repetition, is also responsive to memory. And this memory matters. Because if we forget how close we came, we may not be so lucky next time. If we teach only victories and losses, but not the moments of pause, the breaths between, then we lose the roadmap that helped us survive. These near misses are not failures of policy, they are cries for better design, for humility, for systems that assume error and are resilient to it. In the end, learning from the brink is not about glorifying the close calls. It's about transforming them into wisdom. It's about acknowledging how fragile this global civilization truly is and choosing to guard it, not with more arms, but with more awareness. We are, after all, the inheritors of those who chose not to press the button. And in their hesitation, perhaps, lies our blueprint for a different future, one where peace is not the pause between wars, but the path we deliberately choose, again and again. And yet, even the pessimist must admit, we are still here. Battered, yes. But breathing. Capable, still, of a different choice. The fact that we even ask the question, can war be avoided, suggests a flicker of hope that the answer might be yes. Deterrence may keep the wolves at bay, but destiny is not a fixed road. It is a path made by the walking. And if war is a story we keep repeating, then perhaps the task of our time is not to silence the instinct, but to rewrite the ending. It will not be easy. Peace never is. But maybe, just maybe, it is not impossible. Part 40, Choosing the Path Forward, Reflections on a World Still in Our Hands. As the long arc of our inquiry comes to its close, we find ourselves standing not at the end, but on a threshold. The question that echoed in the beginning, whether a third world war looms, has taken us through the twisted corridors of geopolitics, technology, psychology, and memory. And now, we arrive at a place not of certainty, but of clarity. Because war, despite all predictions, calculations, and provocations, is not inevitable. It is a choice. A consequence. A direction we may walk toward, or step back from. The future, though shrouded in the fog of what-ifs and if-onlys, remains negotiable. Still within reach. Still in our hands. The story of civilization has never been one of linear progress. It has been a dance between brilliance and brutality, unity and fracture, construction and collapse. We are not the first generation to imagine that the world teeters on the brink, nor will we be the last to wonder what force might tip it. But what makes this moment different is the breadth of awareness. Never before have so many known so much about so many. Never before has information, both true and false, spread at the speed of thought. Never before has the fate of the planet rested in so many hands, yet felt so vulnerable to so few. And yet, despite this daunting complexity, one truth endures: peace is not passive. It is not the absence of war, but the presence of justice, empathy, and hard-won compromise. It is built, not found. Sustained, not assumed. And it demands the courage to imagine something other than dominance and defeat. It asks us to believe that there are better uses for our minds than weaponry, better purposes for our economies than arms races, better outlets for our fears than violence. The way forward is not paved with certainty, but with choices. The choice to invest in education that teaches not only critical thinking, but compassion. The choice to elevate diplomacy above provocation. The choice to build systems that anticipate human error, that prioritize de-escalation over posturing, that reward listening as much as leading. It is the choice to remember, not only the horrors of past wars but the quiet near misses, the hands that trembled and did not launch, the men and women who questioned, paused, withheld. This is not to say we can prevent every conflict. But perhaps we can prevent the total collapse of the global order. Perhaps we can recognize the warning signs not as distant flickers, but as personal alarms. Perhaps we can foster a global culture where dignity is not bound by nationality, and disagreement is not an invitation to annihilation. Hope, in this fragile century, is not naive. It is radical. It is a declaration that we are not bound to repeat our worst mistakes. That with awareness, humility, and shared vision, we can resist the gravitational pull of destruction. And so, as we close this meditation on a question too big for one voice to answer, let us not imagine the world spinning toward doom as a foregone conclusion. Let us see it instead as a story still unfolding. A book still being written. A future that asks, more than anything, that we care. Care enough to listen before we strike. Care enough to think before we echo. Care enough to wonder what it means to live in a time where annihilation is possible, and choose not to walk that road. In our hands rests not just the memory of war, but the blueprint for peace. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is the greatest power of all.